Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 130 of Through the Years, the podcast that reviews Ring of Honor show by show from the beginning. My name is Trevor Dame, joined as always by the co-captain of this train, or even the co-conductor. I guess it'd be a conductor, not a captain of a train, Matt Feuerstein. Matt, after this episode, we'll have one more episode after this, and then we're through 2006. This is the penultimate episode. It's rare you get to use the word penultimate unless you're constantly on the verge of finishing something, but not quite. So the penultimate episode of this year.
We're edging 2006? Is that what you're trying to say?
We are always edging, Matt.
Oh, okay. If you say so. As I said, I always have to start the show with just like completely putting off anyone who might be listening for the first time with something absolutely disgusting. So I guess that's what's happened once again. It's hard for me to like hold in the sort of like the big picture 2006 thoughts that I have, especially through these last few shows, because obviously I think we need to save them for the next episode. But I do have a lot, and this show might not have contributed that much to those big picture thoughts, but I'd say a little bit. It's not a zero contribution level of show.
No, we'll get to it. There's some interesting things on the show. There's something on the show that infuriated me, but also a little insight into the mind of how I lay out like the run sheets of this podcast, how I plot things out. If it's a double shot, I will try and put if the news that I could say for either episode, things that happen between episodes of Through the Years in the timeline. On a double shot, I'll go, well, which one will we probably be have less to talk about during the show? And I'll try and load that up with more of the news. We actually have a few bits of news, some interesting little news things. I don't want to raise people's expectations too high, but we got a few little bits of news here. I am sticking on this one because
it's really sorry, no, I was going to say it's interesting how little news there's been over the last like dozen shows. This has been such a like we talked about how this is kind of like a dry winter, but like in every way, this was just such a dry era for ROH. It's kind of bizarre, like to think about. Like anytime you say there's news, I'm like, really? I'm so it's been so long. It used to be that each episode like was like loaded with like stuff going on behind the scenes and big changes, and now it's like, God, nothing happens.
Well, I had to comb, and some of the stuff, maybe news is a little tenuous, but I think I got some interesting things here. So how about we get to it? In fact, the first thing we have is notes from a Bryan Danielson interview that he conducted at this time for InsidePulse.com. Now, that is a throwback by Aaron Glazer. And I thought there were some interesting quotes that kind of gave some insight into what Bryan Danielson was thinking at this point in his career. The first quote would be I'm just reading some quotes here. Danielson said he's watched CM Punk succeed in WWE, but he doesn't think he has the TV personality that they're looking for. And he, of course, Bryan's talking about himself, obviously. That is why he is the Through the Years spirit animal, because I was listening to the great Trish and Sarah wrestling podcast yesterday, and I was listening to an episode trying to catch up, but they said, talked about how they have a theory that like, everyone that covers wrestling or watches it has like a special little guy, which just to like me that phrase of someone that they like, kind of favor and have bias towards and have a super soft spot for. I think clearly Bryan Danielson is the special little guy Through the Years. Not
a very bold pick by us, though, I would say.
Really going outside the box by saying, who we like from Ring of Honor in the early years. Bryan Danielson, he's pretty good. But I think if you apply that more to all of wrestling, he would still be our special little guy. But even then, not exactly a bold pick for a couple of middle-aged, nerdy, white wrestling fans to go, Bryan Danielson, he's pretty good. So, but
might be the most obvious person to pick. But he's still special. He's still our little guy. So it fits.
Matt, we are nothing but two basic bitches. But Bryan, this is what Bryan said about the situation. He wrote, "If I were to go to WWE, that's one of those things where your career is pretty much in their hands," he told Aaron Trailblazer. CM Punk has done a great job with the opportunity he's been given, but like he's got a lot of skills that appeal to WWE. Like he's a great interview guy, and his wrestling skills make him different than a lot of the guys on the roster. I think my wrestling skills would make me different than a lot of the guys on the roster, but I'm not sure I'm the type of interview wrestler that they like to put on TV. So again, it's always fun to hear Brian put down his interviews when he would become like literally like an award-winning like best interview guy in the business for a period of time, and like still a great interview.
And we liked his interviews in 2006. I think if you listen to the shows, you can verify that. He was already good. Yes, he would get a lot better, but he was already good. I guess we've been saying this for years and years now, so I guess it's not interesting to say. But
we were saying he had charisma, so like even though he wasn't really cutting interviews, like he's definitely improved at his interviews over the years, but he already had charisma, like in the ring from the get-go. Like people that tried to film into like I think that's something we really railed against, and that is maybe a little bit more a slightly rare opinion, this idea that, you know, I think a lot of people would admit now, oh yeah, Bryan Danielson's very charismatic now. He's great on interviews now. I would say he improved in interviews through the years, but like there was some people that would say that, oh, Bryan Danielson had no charisma at all. Bryan Danielson might say that, who knows, you know, the way he is, but like I think that is one thing we have done a little bit of work kind of pointing out even from the start. Like in the ring, he was always interacting with fans. He was not like the quote unquote vanilla midget that like froze or was just dead faced. He always had stuff to offer in that respect.
And in like backstage skits on like the first or second ROH DVDs too. He had you could see a sense of humor shining through and stuff like that, which, you know, I mean, like, took a long time to get that out of like a Dean Malenko or Chris Benoit. I mean, Chris Benoit never showed a sense of humor, I would say, maybe a couple times. But Malenko, you know, was the Iceman and stuff. I think that's who people always compared him to. And then people would be like, oh, wow, you know, he's doing silly stuff in WWE. And, you know, he's so funny behind the scenes. But Danielson was, you know, showing the charm pretty early on, even if he didn't completely get, I'd say, the interviews down until 2006. I'd say that's when the interview stuff really started to completely click for him. And I think you can go back and watch a lot of really good 2006 Bryan Danielson interviews. But I will say that the way he analyzed how WWE would react to him, I think was pretty accurate. I mean, even in 2009, 2010, 2011, when he was first there, you know, Vince McMahon looked at Bryan Danielson and saw, you know what we should do with this guy? Call him a virgin and make fun of him all the time and have him do stupid dances where he's considered a crazy, weird nerd. And that's the best way to get Bryan Danielson over, I think. Right? That's what Vince McMahon thought. And obviously, eventually, he came to realize Bryan's assets, and I hope that Triple H already knew them, but, you know, who knows the way he was back then. I don't think I'm speaking out of school to say that Paul Levesque in that era was pretty darn insecure about his spot and protecting a certain type of person in WWE and kind of maybe doing a little bit to sabotage people who didn't fit the mold or maybe were a threat in other ways. I think that's a fairly standard opinion, right? Am I wrong?
No, Matt, he's the kindly father figure of pro wrestling. He would never do something like that.
Now, it's kind of funny, like, realizing that was just what everyone kind of knew for a fact between, like, 2001 or 2000 and 2014, 2015. And if I say it now, it's like if the wrong person hears this, I'm going to be inundated with people being like, you know, jumping down my throat, calling me like a hater or like that I work for AEW or something like that. Like just by saying what was completely common knowledge at one point. But point being, to bring it back to Bryan Danielson, even though if they had decided to get behind him in 2006, 2007, I think he would have gotten over and done fine. They wouldn't have. And so he's completely right about what would have happened probably if he went there at that point.
Yeah, and let's not forget when I'm reading this interview, we're probably a year and a half removed from a time period in 2005 where Bryan Danielson was so disenfranchised about like his opportunities in pro wrestling, he was considering quitting. So like, he probably isn't in still even at this point in like the most upbeat headspace about like what his opportunities are. And in fact, going to another opportunity, continuing on in the interview, on the possibility of working for TNA, Danielson said it would depend on the type of offer presented to him. He echoed what many wrestlers have said about not being able to travel overseas, especially to Japan, for extended tours with an every other week TV taping schedule in TNA. Quote, if it's something where they really have big plans for me and that sort of thing, then going there would be a lot of fun, he said. A lot of the offers they're offering people, I would make less money and would be kind of restrictive than I am right now. I enjoy going to Japan and I enjoy wrestling for Ring of Honor and I enjoy the opportunity to go and spend 4 months in England. I didn't get into wrestling to make tons of money. I never thought I'd make a whole lot of money. I got into wrestling because I thought it'd be fun to go somewhere and make less money than I'm making now and then be restricted in what I can do. That's not really where I want to do, Brian Grammer, at this point in my life. So, yeah, and we'll get to that a little more in another story, but like, yeah, like this idea, it depends who you are. Like people are thinking always the company that's bigger offers you more money. It always depends on like the deals, right? And so like the entry level low card guy in TNA at this point probably was not making as much as Bryan Danielson when you factor in like all the indie dates and being the top guy in the in ROH and running the wrestling school, although that will soon end for him. And so yeah, this idea for Bryan Danielson, like unless they were if they were going to give him probably the contract that like Samoa Joe is probably currently working with in TNA at this point in time, yeah, it might be worth his while. But they were just going to treat him like any low X division guy that they're just bringing in because he got a little bit of buzz on the indies. I think he's absolutely right that it would have been, for a guy who really creatively loves wrestling, it would have been nothing but him being able to do less things for less money probably.
Yeah, and also like other than Samoa Joe, we've seen a lot of people get wasted by TNA during that era. Whether it ended up, what the Young Bucks ended up happening to, even Okada, right, was there, and they didn't make much use of him at all. And Austin Aries certainly didn't during that era get to be what he could be in TNA. Roderick Strong, a lot of these guys in this time period, and so. Yeah, I guess you'd have to ask Danielson, but it seems like he probably made the right choice. Obviously, eventually he does go to WWE, and I think that's 3 years after this, and I think there's a point where you feel like you've done everything you could do on the indies, but he wasn't there yet, and he had a lot of good years left on the indies, and I think it probably, again, like I don't want to speak for him. At least from a fan's perspective, it probably ended up all working out for the best.
Yeah. Like I would guess if you ever got a chance to talk to Bryan Danielson, he is probably now, like especially even just looking at like quotes like we just read, he's probably made more money in pro wrestling than he ever thought he was ever going to make.
Well, if he just said he never thought he'd make a lot of money, he's obviously made a lot of money. So I'm going to say I feel pretty confident saying he would say that. Yes.
Yeah, I imagine he never in his wildest dreams
thought he would be a
millionaire.
Thought he'd be the top babyface in WWE, main eventing WrestleMania because of absolute outrageous demand, and then returning as sort of I guess in the second half of the 2010s, he was sort of a beloved, almost like legendary babyface figure until he, as the commissioner, and then turning heel, he was the top heel on at least one of the brands. He came back, later on and got to main event WrestleMania a second time. Just kind of, I'd say that one was that almost was a bonus, that one, right?
Yeah.
And so I'd say by the end he was treated pretty well there. And then going to AEW probably made a ton of money to do that because he's, he could have. He was commanded a negotiating battle. Or a bidding war, I should say, and he chose AEW, and gosh, that's been amazing. And I think that there's so many things that he probably would not have expected to happen at this point. Like you said, 2 years before this, he was like, "Oh, I'm just going to go back to school and try to join the Peace Corps."
Yeah. And the last quote from this interview, which I think really it made me feel bad for the man. Danielson addressed his shoulder injury and said he's adjusted to the pain over time. Quote, "It's just something your body adjusts to over time," he said. "But flexibility-wise and strength-wise, when I've gone to my physical therapy, both have decreased. But what's really irritating can be sleeping. I roll over and I roll on my shoulder and I wake up. I have a hard time sleeping anyways. You just can't get back to sleep. Those little things take a toll on your lifestyle, not just what you do in the ring." And that was the thing, reading that, it reminded me that, like, a lot of times, I don't know if other people do this, but when I think of wrestlers having injuries, I only think of, like, oh, that affects what they can do in the ring. I don't think of, like, oh, if you have a serious injury, even if you're working through it, like, that also affects your day-to-day life, like stuff like your sleep or just things like that. Like you just think, okay, if he's not wrestling, he's probably feeling okay. But, like, no, if your shoulder is screwed up, that affects a lot of your life.
Yeah, I've had a shoulder injury before. It definitely does. I tore my labrum once, and I was just like putting on a jacket was hard, putting on a backpack because of the way you had to move your arm back.
Yeah.
And obviously I figured out a way, just put it on that arm first, and then but you know what I mean? Like, you had to realize, I have to adjust some things to be able to do this, and that's a much more minor injury than what Brian was dealing with here.
Do you think MJF stole your gimmick of being Jewish and hurting your shoulder, but valiantly working through it?
I was Mayor MGF before MJF was heard of by anyone. So
exactly.
Uh-huh.
So speaking of,
he stole my initial of having. He stole my gimmick of having MF as my initials, and he changed the G to a J. I mean, come on.
And speaking of being ahead of their time, Wade Keller at this point in the Pro Wrestling Torch, he wrote a column about what his New Year's resolutions for 2007 would be, things he would want to have to see. And he wrote one about Ring of Honor, and his New Year's resolution for Ring of Honor was for Gabe Sapolsky to resolve to get ROH on pay-per-view. So this is a little excerpt from Wade Keller's column. "This is not a request for Ring of Honor to risk what is likely a profitable, stable business plan just for the fame and prestige of being on pay-per-view. And I know TNA tried to run pay-per-views without a basic cable show to promote it, and it didn't work out. But ROH doesn't have to do it the way TNA did with big live satellite expenses, or the way WWE, WCW, and ECW have done it. All ROH needs to do is to send their best DVD event of the month to In Demand and have them offered on tape delay on their pay-per-view rotation. With digital cable, there is no shortage of pay-per-view channels. There are low-end MMA events and low-brow women's wrestling events on pay-per-view channels all the time. ROH, with just their current fan base and word of mouth, could possibly make it worth In Demand's while to queue it up. All ROH needs is a cult following which it could conservatively build upon with good events. They still have their core DVD business to promote, since they'd have several events per month to offer that weren't on pay-per-view, and the pay-per-view exposure could add new DVD customers to their base. Whatever hurdles supposedly exist, they don't need to. ROH's total expense in doing this would be the postage and envelope to send the DVD to In Demand. In Demand's total expense would be to queue it up and offer it in place of one of the many replays offered throughout the week of all their other low-budget pay-per-view offerings. They could try it. If it doesn't work out and only a few hundred are buying it, nothing would really be lost. If it does work out, they could add enough revenue to their budget to pay their hard-working core of wrestlers a better standard of living. At least look into it, huh?" So
that was pretty naive. Like that, you'd think he would know more about how stuff worked than to write something like that.
Although, in a way, I mean, we are very shortly in the timeline of Ring of Honor announcing something fairly close to this.
No, I think there are some big differences between what he's suggesting and what ROH actually did. They had to schedule a pay-per-view taping and say, this is a pay-per-view, in order for In Demand to want, or whoever the pay-per-view companies were, to want to do that. Wade is just saying it's something as simple as, well, this is the best DVD we got. Let me just ship it to In Demand and they'll put it on pay-per-view. Like that's that's what he said, right? Like that's not how it worked.
The cost would just be postage of sending a DVD to them.
Yeah, the logistics were a lot more complicated than that. They had to schedule pay-per-views. They had to figure out a way to then mix those with their continuity of their other DVDs. Like it was a much more complicated process than what he's describing right there. Like the idea that he was like, oh, Final Battle was good. Let's send it to In Demand. Maybe they'll put it on pay-per-view. I mean, I'm sure they would have loved that if they could do it, but that's not how it worked. And Yeah, just when I heard Wade say that at the beginning, I was like, "Oh yeah, maybe, like looks like Carrie listened to him." But then the way he described it, it was like, you, I think, know it's more complicated than this, don't you, Wade?"
I mean, Wade's adorable because sometimes he does get a little naive or pie in the sky about things. And I will say, not to slag him, but like the one I'm like fascinated that you saw the angle when I was focusing more on a different thing, but I think yours is even more valid than mine. But like the one part I thought was a little naive on his part was being like, oh, like, there's no financial downside to this. The one thing about this is, let's say you even charged as much as you charged for a pay-per-view as their full price DVD, $20. DVD, pay-per-view providers typically, cable companies typically charge like half of the price of the pay-per-view is what they take for putting it on the air. So like, I imagine, $10 off a $20 pay-per-view, that's a lower profit margin that you'd make selling the $20 DVD, where I imagine mass producing some El Cheapo DVDs in clamshell cases is probably, you're not spending $10 per DVD on that, but you are spending, half of whatever you're charging for pay-per-view for them to put it on the air.
Right. I guess
So
the idea is if it was as simple as just sending the cable company the DVD and they put it on, then it's in addition to whatever DVDs they're selling and it's
yeah.
exposing it to more eyes, so there really isn't any loss. Again, the problem is it's not that simple.
Yeah, and there would be some fans that would probably switch, right? They'd be like, if I can get this and not have to wait, or, depending on the delay, and maybe I don't want a physical copy. I mean, we've seen now in the far-flung future just how many people are eager to stop having their houses and apartments cluttered with physical stuff if they have the option to. So, and then that brings us to something. This is from the Wrestling Observer TNA news section. At first, you'll be wondering, Trevor, this is interesting, but why is it about Ring of Honor? You'll hear the Ring of Honor connection at the end. But I'm partly reading this because it's connected to Ring of Honor, but I'm partly reading this, quite frankly, because I'm just a little bit fascinated. So this is referring to something that had recently happened in TNA. We'll jump right into the middle of this quote. Dave wrote at the time, and remember, this is about TNA, not Ring of Honor. Regarding the dropping of the company paying for hotels and rental cars, I believe that was only for talent, as the production people will still get their hotels paid for. Only a select few were getting their rental cars taken care of, but everyone had been getting their hotels taken care of before the memo went out. From a PR standpoint, nobody's happy, and a few guys were furious. In a sense, it was an eye-opener, because it's been a long time since anyone talked about the financial condition of the company. I don't think anyone thought the company wasn't still losing money, and they were tight in a lot of ways about spending money, but the attitude was the condition couldn't be that bad with all the appearances of things getting better, such as more publicity on Spike, better time slot, signing Kurt Angle, etc. Some think the signing of Angle and decision to sign Sting for another year, which are huge salaries, are very different because Sting hasn't meant a thing for buy rates in months and doesn't work arena shows. Angle does a lot more, but is now a mere mortal because of the way he's been booked. For one thing, since the next show isn't until January 14th, they could have waited this week to tell people without it ruining everyone's Christmas, although the end result would be the same. The shuttle from the airport to the hotel cost $24, and the hotel rooms cost $69, nice, at the DoubleTree, although most will probably opt for a cheaper $49 hotel in the same area if they are paying for it. Actually, we may get back to the old days of 4 or more to a room like the guys do in Ring of Honor, where the company pays for the hotels. But when you consider that most of the talent is earning $300 to $750 per shot, the lower end guys who are struggling in the first place are the ones who are hit the hardest. So yeah, I thought that was, again, and I think that really works well with the Bryan Danielson quote earlier about like how, hey, depending on what opportunity TNA offers me, it might be a pay cut for me. Like if you're making $300 and then now at this point paying for your hotel and transportation, like, yeah, I have to imagine Bryan Danielson was making more on the indie scene at this point. And I did think it was also interesting, like, Ring of Honor was paying for hotels at this point, like cramming people into rooms. But I guess in a way that makes sense because I imagine Ring of Honor was not paying a ton to most of their talent. So for some talent, getting like the perk of like gas money or hotel, like it's the difference between you like breaking even or losing money working an indie date. So this is what I was talking about before, where like, not everything is what it seems when it comes to what you make in wrestling in the big companies. Well, even like people have talked these days where I think they say like the lowest main roster salary in WWE now is like $300,000. But you have to remember in WWE, they pay for your airfare. They don't pay for your hotels. They don't pay for your rental cars. And when you're on the road every week of the year, that kind of stuff adds up, right? It's a lot to consider again that people probably don't consider when they just think of what a guy is making in wrestling or how prominent a company they're working in.
I mean, I would say in order to like find out what somebody's really making, you legitimately have to deduct all those work expenses from whatever their salary is, right? Like to really figure out what they make in any kind of appreciable way that would actually impact their lives. If you're paying for all of these things to just do the job in the first place, then, that's not really money you're making, that's money you're putting back into the company. So, cause I have certain things like that in my job, or I think a lot of people do, where it's like, yeah, I mean, I make this much, but money is taken out for this, and this. And it's very deceptive when you like, see even if you believed the like crazy lists that appear online about what wrestlers are making, which are obviously extremely fake, you would still have to subtract a lot of expenses that go into living that life and being part of any of these companies.
Yeah, I was just reading an article this week about like pro hockey players in the NHL, and someone wrote an article kind of breaking down like, if you were a player making $1 million a year, again, you might think, oh, a millionaire, but like the take home would be more like $250,000. They broke down like everything you'd have to pay: escrow, agent fees, taxes, all the nutritionists, all the stuff.
Yeah, even if you just forget income tax, which is an obvious, right? But like all the stuff that you just have to pay as part of the job itself, it's crazy.
Yeah, and so. Yeah, and don't get me wrong. $250,000 is still more than most people would be thrilled to make that in a year. But it's just an example of if you just eyeball, like you just said, like you look at some of these sites, whether their numbers are accurate, and go, wow, this person must be rich. Like they're probably doing well, but not nearly as well as you think when you factor in certain things.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference. There's a difference between somebody making a good salary and somebody just not having to worry about money. And yeah. I think like that often is the difference.
And that's where it all comes from, like the old wrestling saying, it's not what you make, it's what you save. Like I remember in the great like Heroes of World Class documentary, I think they talked about how like Bruiser Brody, you have to imagine, was probably one of the top money makers on the scene in his era. Like someone, I think it was Skandar Akbar, was talking about how he remembered Bruiser Brody on the road would just carry a giant bag full of cans of tuna fish and pork and beans he brought from home. Like it was literally like, wrestlers were cognizant, the smart ones at least, a lot weren't, of like, it costs money to eat out, like
yeah,
if you're eating out on the road all the time.
I wish I had the discipline to eat that cheaply every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's face it. Most wrestlers were not doing the Bruiser Brody or the Mick Foley, like, was it Mick Foley or Owen Hart who was like, I'm not even going to get luggage. I'm going to put my stuff in a trash bag. Like, I'm going to split a hotel even when I'm making like a decent amount of money. Like, again, it's not what you make, it's what you save. But that brings us to the end of the news section. There's one little thing I'm going to bring up before we get to the show, which was the Down to the Wire segment, which I brought in a few episodes ago, where I thought anything interesting from the video wire, since they were kind of expanded, I will bring to the shows. Turns out there hasn't been that much. This barely qualifies, but I thought I'd bring it in. There's one clip from one of the video wires between the last show and this show where we get a Roderick Strong Davey Richards promo segment from FIP, where classic like ROH from this time, you can't understand 2/3 of the promo, and the whole point of them showing this is the promo, but you do get enough to hear the gist of it being that Davey wants a shot at the FIP title at this ROH show, and they then get into a pull apart brawl, and you'll see more of that different video from different FIP shows later on the main show. We'll talk about that then, but then they get into a pull apart brawl, and you can hear one fan in this small FIP crowd just shout out, clearly shouting, "You're strong, smelling." And yeah, that's why I had to include that. So yeah,
well played, sir.
That's why you watch the video wires, folks. But anyway, that brings us to International Challenge. It took place December 22nd, 2006 at the Connecticut Expo Center in Hartford, Connecticut for a reported crowd of 400 fans. PW Insider wrote, the promotion is also loading up their debut in Hartford, Connecticut, as the market always does well for them, and they want to reward fans who have had to deal with numerous location changes and, at one point, watching a show outside of a venue in a tent during a driving rainstorm. In fact, yes, that was the last – I think this is the first show they've ever run in Hartford, but they had previously run in Connecticut. I think East Windsor was the last show. And, yes, that was the infamous Kenta in a Tenta, where at the last minute they had to run in a tent and it was raining and there was holes in the tents. So yeah, this was their make good show for those people apparently, and it's an okay card, but like I wouldn't say it's absolutely loaded card.
I mean, when we name what the opening match was, it's like, okay, in case you were wondering if this is a B show or an A show, I mean, they kind of telegraphed that one, but obviously the Friday night shows are a B show, and given what the next night show is, I think this couldn't have been anything but.
Yeah, and next, from a PW Torch Live report, there was not a name. So I normally like to credit people. I didn't have a name here. So the person who was there wrote, the crowd was reportedly aggravating the wrestlers with horrible chants, especially during the Roderick Strong-Davey Richards match. ROH returns to the Expo Center in Hartford on May 11th. And yes, we'll get to that. But I want to ask you, I thought, Matt, this was like the smarkiest, like in a bad way, like annoying get yourself over crowd I can remember at a Ring of Honor show. There was lots of fans doing like weird chants. We'll call it a couple later. There was multiple matches, both the match they mentioned and I believe the Colt Cabana match, where it felt like the first few minutes of that match they just spent acknowledging the crowd. Like there definitely were a few people in that crowd. It is one of those things where a few bad apples can give a bad impression for the whole bunch, but like of fans that were just saying like things that didn't even apply, that were just bellowing things to get over or to be smartasses. And I mean, I am of the belief you buy a ticket, you can do what you want, but it was noticeable, I would say, on the show in a way it normally isn't.
I more noticed the wrestlers reacting than the chants themselves. I will say this, I think that How We Roll in Long Island in May was definitely was worse than this.
Yeah.
As a crowd, I'd say overall. And I'd actually want to interrogate what you just said about you buy a ticket, you could do what you want. Do you really, really, really feel that way? Like, yes, you can do what you want, but you don't think that there's like just a general, like, I don't know, sort of decorum that should be expected as far as, I don't know, not being a total shithead that ruins the show for everybody else?
Well, okay, I'll put this in, and I knew you're probably going to disagree. Because I think we've talked about this before. I would say, the line I would draw is not something that ruins other people's enjoyment of the show, that like makes them feel unsafe, like being like really misogynistic or.
But you think, you think as long as like if somebody's just like really like on a small show like this, just really drawing incredible amounts of attention to themselves, making it very hard to pay attention to the match, even if they're not doing something horribly offensive in a vacuum, you think like, hey, you know what, that's cool. They bought their ticket. They get to just scream and yell about something complete nonsense and make sure everyone's paying attention to them when they're trying to watch a match.
I think if people around that fan want to tell them, like, you're being a douchebag, could you please stop it? Or as people at this show and many wrestling shows have done, chant at one point at a fan, shut the fuck up. Or but
I feel like that's hurting the show, just having to do that, you know? Like saying, like if I'm like watching a match and then like, you know, for like 2 minutes, people are standing shut the fuck up at some fan who's trying to draw attention to himself. Like, yeah, sure, you're allowed to do that, fine. But I still don't think it makes it okay, I guess is what I would say.
You know what? In a way, I agree with you, but I guess I would say, where do you draw the line? Because there's some fans like that one, they're ultra obvious, right? But then if you make the lines not like actively like racist, objectionable behavior, but just being an annoyance, there are going to be some real obvious, easy cases where, yeah, like 90% of the crowd is just annoyed by this person. But there are going to be cases where it's going to be tougher to make that call, right? Like,
well, yeah, because sometimes the crowd gets into whatever the annoying fan is doing. And then I imagine it's extremely frustrating for the wrestlers and a few of the fans, but a lot of the fans are enjoying it. So, yeah, at that point, yeah, I mean, I think that is a tougher call.
Yeah, it's just tough because there are going to be cases where a guy half the crowd might like what this fan is doing and half the crowd might be rolling their eyes. At that point, do you have the right then to ask someone to throw them out? And like at that point in the building, like if you're management, how do you weigh that? What becomes the metric for deciding how annoying you have to be?
I guess I'm not. I guess we're kind of like maybe talking past each other a little bit. I'm not saying throw the person out. I don't think that that's really something you can justify. But just in terms of me making a judgment, that person is ruining the show. They're an asshole. Like I feel like that's more what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? Maybe we can come to like in the top 10%. Maybe that should be obvious. Like if you're, I would, maybe I would even say this: you get one match. You want to be annoying for one match. Yeah. Like, look, if you want to be annoying for one match, if there's just something that tickles it, you know what? We'll tolerate it. If you're gonna make yourself the story of the whole show, maybe that would be a good line.
Yeah, here's an example of something that I found annoying at a recent show. That I was at last year. It was in an arena. It was an AEW show. And before like a commercial break, the ring announcer was like, oh, like Section 7, hey, Section 9, everyone's cheering. And she forgot to mention Section 5. So for the next match, which was the main event, the Section 5 spent the whole match chanting Section 5 and like yelling like about like how they were ignored, and like they did it for like a 20-minute match, and it was extremely distracting. And it was like, I mean, obviously I don't think that like all the people in Section 5 should have been thrown out. Like, oh, that would have been funny. But I could still be like, what did you pay for? Like, why did you come if this was all you wanted to do? Like that's sort of how I feel about it.
I guess there is also the consideration of, and I don't always agree with this, but I do agree that sometimes, a lot of the time, which is if the crowd is like being shitty, it's or in that case, just kind of chanting random shit to entertain themselves. It's kind of on the wrestlers to gain their attention, and that's not necessarily always fair, but there are times. There are a lot of times when fans are being like just doing random shit like that, them being bored is a component of that sometimes.
I guess I have a hard time believing that when like they're doing it before they even give anyone a chance to do anything.
Yeah.
It's like they just seem dead set on this is what we're going to pay attention to. It's like if you're not going to pay attention in the first place, how are you going to get your attention captured?
Yeah.
You're
right.
I get what you're saying, and I think most people would agree with you, honestly. And I think that there's a lot of truth to it, but I think there's a point where I don't know if there's much that anyone can do. I mean, you've, I'm sure, seen matches where they do capture a distracted crowd's attention by doing something crazy, right? And if you're not going to suddenly get somebody deeply emotionally invested in like 2 seconds, but you could certainly get them to pay attention by doing something crazy, and they they chant whatever they're going to chant, and then they go back to being distracted or bored or whatever it is. And I've definitely heard that argument a lot. Like, this is the wrestler's job. This is the promotion's job. If a crowd is dead or a crowd's not interested, it's because you're not giving them what they want. I've never really bought into that because I've been to a lot of live shows, and I just have been to crowds that were bad. Like, I just, that's how I feel. And that's different than being a dickhead and trying to ruin a show on purpose, but I guess it's all connected.
Well, also, I want to be clear, like, don't be a dick at shows. Like, even whether I think you sometimes have the right or not, I will judge you. I will think you're an asshole, and you will have people like me like looking at you and resenting you and being like, "What a douchebag."
Yeah, and
do you want to be that person? Do you want to be that person?
And I do think that probably more people agree with you than agree with me on this one. But what can I say? I've been to shows. I've seen people that are, in my opinion, ruining my enjoyment by trying to get themselves over at the expense of what I paid to watch. And I certainly never say anything or complain, but in my head, I'm just thinking, man, I wish that we could just enjoy the show that I'm trying to enjoy.
Yeah. Just don't be like, do you want to be the kind of person where even if people aren't yelling at you, a lot of people are just rolling their eyes and looking at you and groaning? Like, do you want to be, you know what? Some people do want to be that person. That's the sad thing. But, And that our last quote before we finally get to the show, Figure 4 Weekly, the rare Brian Alvarez quote. I just thought this was a classic Brian Alvarez style Brian quote. He wrote from the live notes of the show in the student matches. And by the way, this was the only evidence of student matches. Not only could I not find them on Cage Match, which is often the case, but I couldn't even find this from live reports or anything. So this is the only evidence I have of any student match. Brian wrote, in the student matches, a dude named Alex Sugarfoot, all caps with spaces between sugar and foot, beat a guy called, seriously, Chris Masters. Why would you ever take that name? Why not call yourself David Flair? And that is a very 2006 Brian Alvarez quote, especially because that's the sign of the times, because Chris Masters became a pretty decent wrestler. But this was the time where he was like one of the top whipping boys when he was called up too soon and was green and pushed hard. And one of those classic WWE things where once he finally starts getting some experience and gets decent, now he's not getting pushed hard. So classic WWE of the era. But we open with the ROH tag team champions Christopher Daniels and Matt Sydal, along with Allison Danger backstage. Daniels says their title reign may have started out rocky with the injury to Matt's knee, but they know how important the titles are, and so they put out open contracts, and the first team to accept them were Shima and Shingo from Dragon Gate. Daniels calls Shima the best technical wrestler in Japan. Daniels says he and Sydal have every facet of pro wrestling covered, though, from the mat to the air and high above. I was like, the air and high above, what in wrestling is higher than the air? But apparently there is something, and they have it covered. Daniel says their road to greatness begins tonight. Sydal says he knows the Dragon Gate style and how their roster thinks, and he's ready with his $1 million smile and his knee that's worth $1 million. But he also says that knee might not be 100%, but he's ready to carry the load for the team. Sydal walks away, and Daniels and Allison Danger look at each other with that same "what the heck is wrong with him" kind of look that they shared on the last show. Except this time the promo from Sydal honestly wasn't cocky enough, I thought, to warrant that. Like, he wasn't that cocky here.
Well, I think you might have misquoted, because I got to go back and look. Maybe I did. You said ready to carry the load for the team. I think he said ready to carry the team, which is a much more cocky thing to say than carry the load. I guess we'll have to go back and watch, see which of us quoted it correctly. But also, he's wearing like a gray tweed hat that is like, okay, this is a sign that this guy is very arrogant. And maybe Daniels and Danger were taken aback by his hat. Did you ever think of that?
I would be taken back by the hat. And yeah, I guess it all hinges on the word load. So much like that scene in There's Something About Mary, Matt, it's all about is there a missing load or not. But we move on. Daniels and Allison Danger leave as Sydal had also left, and the promo was over. But sweet and sour Larry Sweeney, making his ROH debut, darts into frame.
An auspicious debut for Larry Sweeney here.
Yeah, Larry introduces himself and asks us to say hello to our new best friend. He's straight off the express train from Redondo Beach. He's arrived in the Ring of Honor. If you want to know why, that's for him to know and us to find out. Larry cackles. And yes, this is in fact the very first appearance in Ring of Honor of Sweet and Sour Larry Sweeney.
He literally bursts onto the scene here.
So it's interesting. I was thinking about when I was doing the notes and watching the show, I was thinking, like, how do we cover this? Because obviously I think most of our listeners are probably people that were around for the time. But I do know for a fact we have some listeners that are like in their early 20s that are like watching Ring of Honor for the first time and like using the show, the podcast as a companion piece. Like, so I honestly, I always envision when this will probably not be true. People will be listening to these shows, Matt, for years and years after this. This will be a key point of a chapter of wrestling history. But like,
until the owners of the internet decide they're going to wipe everything that was on it already. You know what I mean? Which they could do at any time. It'll
just be me with my USB thumb drive going to everyone's door and personally introducing them to the show. But
do you have all these episodes saved on USB?
I have some on a USB hard drive. Honestly, that's a good reminder. I need to update that because I don't have a lot of the recent ones.
There you go. Do it.
So if you don't know Larry Sweeney, because Larry Sweeney tragically took his own life many years ago, he was a guy that was kind of, I think you could say, was simultaneously ahead and behind the times. Like people say he was born 10 years too late or 15 years too late. But honestly, when you look at the wrestling landscape now and how managers have become kind of back into vogue, he was also born 10 to 15 years too soon, because I think he would have succeeded more, even though, in his brief time here, he did become a notable name in the independent wrestling world. But like,
what I would say is, rather than being born too soon, he just left too soon. Because
yes,
if he had stuck around, no matter whether he was born later or when he would be a big part of wrestling today and I think be very successful.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, Matt. Especially when you see like a guy like Prince Nana having such great success now, from the same era. He could be in a spot like that today. But yeah, so Larry Sweeney was a guy on the indie scene. He was, I would think, most known for his Chikara work. And if you did not see Larry Sweeney, his character was kind of like an 80s throwback. But I think the thing that would separate Larry Sweeney would be a lot of wrestlers have done the 80s throwback thing. And when you watch them, they come off as, they are doing 80s style shtick. Like they're doing an 80s style promo, where Larry Sweeney, I thought, was just like, this guy feels like he just was transported from the 80s. Like there are guys who would do the 80s style promo. I go, okay, that's kind of a fun novelty, but if you transport this guy into the 1980s, he wouldn't. This would be a little too on the nose. It'd be a little uncanny valley. It's kind of close to what they were doing, but not quite. Larry Sweeney felt like a guy who was just cutting great promos with 1980s style like energy to them. He was a master, I think, of something we kind of playfully teased Dan Moffat at times for in the first year or two of Through the Years, where Dan Moffat would do the quiet, loud, quiet promo, but he would sometimes kind of overuse it. I think Larry Sweeney was great at changing like tone mid promo at the right times, where he would just come off as loud and unhinged, but get very quiet and deadly serious at the right times on a dime. And he also kind of wrestled a bit, for the modern indie taste at the time. He was he was not considered a super worker. He was not a guy doing a bunch of innovative moves or a million miles a second. His finisher was a top rope elbow drop. But he was considered to be, I would say, like a guy to watch out for, a great talker, a great unique personality in wrestling. And I remember being so happy to see him in Ring of Honor, because it was like he filled some holes Ring of Honor was having at this time, which, Ring of Honor could always, at pretty much every point in their history, use more guys who could talk. I think they could use, at this point in their history, especially another good manager, especially with Nana leaving just months earlier. So I felt he filled some holes there on paper. We'll reevaluate how his run worked out. And I would also say, lastly, like Sweeney was just like, before we really had like a real thumping social media environment for pro wrestling, like before things really had opportunities to go viral, I would say like Larry Sweeney was one of the first guys I noticed that kind of went viral, where like the first things I noticed was like people being like, I've uploaded this clip to some hinky site, like you've got to watch this 360p clip of Larry Sweeney from a Chikara show, like cutting a promo. And just like the promos people would share, it would be like, I remember the first promo that really I heard buzz about was one he cut from a bathroom eating a Wendy's Frosty. And I remember that being like something like that. That was the equivalent of like 2005, whatever, to the equivalent of something. It went as viral as something like that could in that period. I think today it would have gone a lot. Again, another example of him being ahead of his time in a way is, stuff like that would have caught on way more now with Twitter and everything and TikToks and all sorts of stuff like that. But Matt, before I get your thoughts on Larry Sweeney, I'll just finish with one quote here. This is from Brian Alvarez, who was, of course, would become, somewhat close to Larry Sweeney. They would, in fact, starting in 2007, work like a year and a half long program. Brian wrote on Figure 4 Weekly on Larry Sweeney and his ROH debut. He wrote, quote, Gabe Sapolsky, and I want to note, Brian also spelled Sapolsky S-K-I, not S-K-Y, and it is hilarious, like the Torch and the Figure 4 Weekly both misspelled Gabe Sapolsky's name for years, even though Dave always spelled it right, and he had now been in the public eye for years. But anyway, Gabe Sapolsky on Wrestling Observer Live sort of said without saying that Larry's in-ring wrestling isn't quite ready for ROH yet. He's a great promo and a great character. I can tell you that, as I guess anyone who actually worked in a previous life as a legit carny. And yes, that's the other thing about Larry. He legitimately used to have worked in the carnivals. So he is, in fact, a carny. But yeah, that's another thing is Ring of Honor decided like he was going to be more of a strictly a manager when elsewhere he was a wrestler, you know.
Yeah,
so, Matt,
you summed up. You summed up Larry Sweeney. I mean, there's really not much for me to add other than he really becomes a pretty big part of ROH in 2007, and definitely a breath of fresh air, considering how the word we've been using over and over again the past few months was dry, and I don't want to say he was wet, but he definitely wasn't dry. So I think he does add a lot of flavor and spice and personality, and that was something that was sorely missing. And I'm excited to revisit it. There were some ups and downs of this run. There's one moment in 2008 that I can remember that we got a lot of negative attention at the time, but we are so far away from that I think I'm looking forward to just enjoying the ride.
Yeah. Let's enjoy the sunshine right now. But we then go to the ring, and where ring announcer Bobby Cruz welcomes the crowd to Ring of Honor when Samoa Joe's music hits, and out he comes in street clothes. He's actually noticeably limping to the ring. He grabs the mic and apologizes for not being able to compete tonight. We'll get to why in a second. There's then an extremely obvious cut where something was edited out, and I'm pretty certain I can tell you what that is as well. We'll get to that in a second. Anyway, Joe welcomes us to Ring of Honor. He talks about this being ROH's debut in Hartford and how tonight you're going to see guys who bust their asses, not for the money, but for the love of pro wrestling. So a quick little introduction from Joe.
This was that was a moment that I think was probably cool for the live crowd, but added absolutely nothing to the DVD. That little segment with Joe, like that could have been completely cut from the DVD. Nothing would have been lost. I mean, it's important to have Joe after the live crowd because he was advertised. That was just a complete nothing of a segment, though.
I do know sometimes when they ran a new market for the first time, they often like to have an opening kind of introduction, say hello. But I will say this. They had been running East Windsor. I looked it up on Google before the show. East Windsor is like a 20-minute drive from Hartford.
Yeah,
so this is crazy.
Not a new market. Not a new market, yeah.
Yeah. So Joe's injury will go to the Wrestling Observer TNA section. Samoa Joe suffered in TNA what was believed to be a third-degree MCL sprain in a TV match taped on December 11th. He threw a kick and could feel his knee give out. It's the same knee he's been having problems with and went out several months ago. The preliminary report was that he doesn't look like he'll need surgery, but may be out a few weeks. He canceled his bookings this coming weekend, and it was thought the odds were against him being able to wrestle at the next tapings. This is the TNA TV tapings. The pay-per-view isn't until January 14th, and it's at least thought for now that he'll be okay to wrestle by then. And I can tell you, in fact, he did wrestle at the Final Resolution pay-per-view on that day. He wrestled a half-an-hour Iron Man match with Kurt Angle, so he came back quickly and did not have an easy way to come back. As far as how this affected the Ring of Honor shows, Dave would write in The Observer, due to his knee injury, Samoa Joe made the call on December 19th that he wasn't able to going to be able to wrestle on this coming weekend shows, ROH shows, on December 22nd in Hartford and on December 23rd at the Manhattan Center. He was in a four corners match with Homicide, Bryan Danielson, and Nigel McGuinness in Hartford, and a singles match with McGuinness at the Manhattan Center. So yeah, that is one of the handy things, Matt, about having guys, as Gabe sometimes like to do, having two feuds at the same time, because Jimmy Rave has existing feuds with Nigel McGuinness. So literally he just slots Jimmy Rave into Joe spots on both nights. And it works out cleanly in that sense. But then, Matt, we get to the quote. And I swear, folks, we'll get to the show itself, but there was just some stuff to talk about. And there's actually a lot of things not to talk about as we get to the show. But going to the quote, because this quote that got edited out of the DVD actually has it gets referenced, I can tell you someone who's read ahead, for months in the newsletter. So we'll go first to the PW Insider. Samoa Joe will still be appearing Oh, wait. No, this is not the quote yet. This is one other thing about Joe's absence. Samoa Joe will still be appearing at this weekend's events for Ring of Honor, although obviously he won't be taking part in any matches. The promotion will not be bringing in any new outside talent to take Joe's place in his scheduled matches, as last-minute airfares during holiday season are insanely overpriced. So look for someone within the roster to be moved into those roles or some matches to be rearranged. So yeah, again, another example on this episode of like the economy of small-scale wrestling, the idea of like, look, we ain't paying no Christmas airfares to fly someone in to add to this card. But now we get to the quote from Joe. Figure 4 Weekly wrote, Joe, oh wait, again, Matt, I'm forgetting how many notes I have. But
Man.
Brian Alvarez wrote in Figure 4 Weekly, Joe is currently undergoing aquatic training and such for his knee issues and will be out of action until the January 14th TNA pay-per-view. He was able to walk around their ROH shows this weekend, but only for limited periods of time. And yeah, you can really see him hobbling. So like, part of me was even thinking like, maybe he shouldn't even come to these shows. I imagine he would really want to see Homicide win, and Ring of Honor probably paid him anyway, so he probably felt like I should contribute to these shows somehow. But yeah, man is struggling out there. And
yeah. With all your extra notes, I'm like, this is a real throwback episode where you were just thorough as hell with this stuff. Nice job.
You brought on yourself not saying that we haven't had a lot of news. I dug for notes on this, but finally we'll get to the quotes. Okay. PW Torch Live report. Samoa Joe walked out to greet the crowd and apologized for not being able to wrestle. He said, quote, "Sorry, on the way over here, I tripped over some bad booking."
Oh, yeah. I remember that now.
And I can tell you, Matt, as someone that's done a lot of research for the months ahead, TNA was extremely pissed off about this. This would come up over and over again in multiple different, not just one newsletter, but in like the Observer and the Torch. These are some quotes for the next few months. Here's the Torch. They wrote, one TNA source says, Joe claimed he meant the comment about Ring of Honor, and it was meant to be storyline oriented. But in any case, the widespread belief in TNA is that it was a dig at Jeff Jarrett, Vince Russo, and Dutch Mantell for how he has been booked.
How would bad booking be ROH storyline oriented?
Yeah, I would say I'm a big fan of Samoa Joe. He seems like a cool guy. Joe, that is a weak excuse. That does no way make sense that would be Ring of Honor was not the kind to do work shoot things like that. I think Joe had been booked very respectfully.
That would have been like something he might have cut in a promo on Nitro in like the middle of the year 2000, but not ROH in 2006.
And again, ROH edited it out of the DVD. They knew that it was going to piss people off, and they knew how it was going to be seen. It was about TNA. In fact, we'll go all the way to the February 12th, 2007 Observer. They were still talking about it then. This is about some other PR snafu, but Joe's thing will come into it. Dave wrote, after those interviews, TNA sent out a memo to all talent telling them that if anyone does an unauthorized media interview, they will be fined one pay-per-view payoff. The company wants to punish Kip James for his comments last week. Exactly what will be done isn't clear. There is also heat with Samoa Joe's comments regarding tripping over some bad booking on the way to the show, he said in December, where he missed an ROH house show over a knee injury. Going to the PW Torch in the TNA news section later on, they wrote, there was also hard feelings in TNA over a lie attributed to Joe about tripping over bad booking. And then finally, we'll go to another different issue at a different time of the PW Torch. The general consensus among wrestlers, say sources, is that Samoa Joe was asked to put over Tomko and Christian as punishment for the tripped over bad booking line he used at a Ring of Honor show. He told Dixie Carter that he was simply cutting a wrestling promo and didn't even have TNA in mind when he made the comment, but apparently the TNA creative team isn't buying it. Then again, if Joe is upset over his recent losses, he's not showing any signs of it in the locker room. One wrestler knows that Joe has a I don't give a fuck attitude regarding his TNA push. Actually, that approach isn't limited to Joe, as most of the younger wrestlers, particularly in the X division, share in his sentiment that they don't believe the current creative team will ever utilize them properly. So yeah, TNA, I mean, I think TNA probably made their mind about pulling Joe from, because I think they made their decision in late 2006.
Was this when Vince Russo was booking TNA?
Well, it said that one quote they thought was a shot at Jeff Jarrett, Vince Russo, and Dutch Mantell. So I imagine that had to have been the team at this point. But I can't imagine this helped, because this goes back to something that TNA, we've been tracking this since they were both around. TNA was always resentful of Ring of Honor, people that worked in both companies shitting on TNA while praising Ring of Honor. And here you guys have a big name, a pay-per-view main eventer at this point on a Ring of Honor show saying, hey, how about that fucking TNA booking? And apparently they punished him for this. So, look, it wasn't a smart move. Don't say that shit out in public.
But I will say that Kip James, he sure got the last laugh on TNA. He did fine for himself.
And that brings us, finally, folks, we're here. The opening match, and boy, is it worth the wait. Our opening match, Jason Blade defeated Pele Primo in 4 minutes, 28 seconds after hitting a moonsault. I'll have to go to the Sean Radican review of this show, Matt, because there was a quote here that just tickled me pink. Sean Radican wrote about this match. This is his review. He gave it 3/4 of a single star. Jason Blade defeated Pele Primo. This was a short opener between two young wrestlers. Although this match was short, it seemed to drag after the first few minutes. Not the best way to open an ROH DVD. Matt, it was 4 minutes and 28 seconds. How could it drag after the first few minutes? It was only a few minutes.
Yeah, that's confounding to me. I also thought this was better than 3/4 of a star, didn't you?
Yeah, I would say that too. So what do you think about the match? Let's go into it.
I mean, okay, so the first thing, no offense to Jason Blade, but his entrance music is way too dramatic for his place on the roster. There's like a whole big like preamble where it's like dun 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 dun, dun, and it's like oh my god, someone's really important's coming out. And like again, no offense to Jason Blade, but in the context of 2006 Ring of Honor, he is not someone really important. So I think that's funny that like back in this era of indies, it's just like everybody had this like really dramatic intro to their entrance music. Well, not everybody, but like enough people that Jason Blade had it, and I don't know. I found that pretty amusing. I guess what I would say about this match was it had energy. It wasn't. I don't think it was like bad or anything. There wasn't a spot where Blade tried to land on his feet off a monkey flip and doesn't quite nail it. But otherwise, he does do a really cool looking dive right off the bat. I'd say that was the highlight of the match. They do some reversals, and Blade gets the quick pin after super kick and a moonsault. I did think it was a little weird that they were starting to give Pele Primo a push, and then he just loses to Jason Blade in 4 minutes. I didn't really get that, especially since they're building him up for, some sort of match with Shane Hagedorn. I don't get why he was basically just a jobber here in some ways. I mean, this match couldn't have been that good because it was short and had nothing behind it. But I also don't think it was bad in any way for what they had time to do. It was fine for like a BBB show opener, I guess. And the crowd was okay with it. They weren't dead or mocking it. I didn't notice any heckling. Still, it was hard to have any big moment to pay attention to more than realizing that Lenny Leonard was back on commentary, and that was exciting. And when he was explaining, his time away, he did maybe something that no one else in history has ever done. Can you guess what I'm going to say, Trevor?
Is it thank his predecessor in a really gracious way, like the guy who filled in for him?
No, although that was nice. It did involve thanking, something even more unusual than thanking your predecessor. He thanked his insurance company for his knee surgeries. He said, because Hartford is the insurance capital of the U.S., I don't think anyone has ever been like, wow, I'm so grateful for my insurance company. So, Lenny Leonard, you are the one and only.
Yeah, so I would say from a ROH like marquee standpoint, this was a very weak opener because it's a 4.5 minute squash for a guy you're barely using and not pushing at all over a student, albeit. And I agree with you, Matt. This would have been a great chance to give Pele a win, because like Jason Blade after the show, he's not getting. There's nothing big planned for him. You could have had him lose here,
for sure.
But I also agreed that it was perfectly fine for a squash. Like, it wasn't anything special, but like you said, it was energetic. It's the usual kind of squash cadence where, the guy winning controls most of it, but he gives his opponent a couple, spots to get a little bit of something. The most notable parts of the match itself, I would say, is there's a spot where Pele is in the ring selling, but he's got his head sticking out between like the second and top rope. He's kind of just leaning out to rest, and Blade is on the floor, and he runs and hits like a jumping big boot to the head from the floor to Pele's head between the second and top ropes, which I thought was like a more agile version of like the drive-by or something. I thought that was really cool. And the other notable thing for this match is for most of it looked like Blade hurt himself because he was frequently shaking out one leg and favoring it. And after the match, it looks like he's really limping. I think you could even hear a fan ask him if his leg's okay. But yeah, the big story is Lenny Leonard is back after the big absence, and I think Lenny and Dave will now be our commentary team for the rest of the podcast run. I think they don't have any more changes. We've made it to the final form of Ring of Honor commentary in the Gabe era, Matt. So yeah, and as you mentioned, like it was interesting to hear him come back because, like you mentioned, he thanks the ROH fan base for all the cards and letters he received. He received as he recuperated from 4 knee surgeries. He says, first off, I wonder if it'd be hilarious. That is a very like 1986 Jim Crockett Promotions. Thanks for all the cards and letters. So like I would be shocked if he got a lot of cards and letters. It would be nice if he did. But anyway, he says he recuperated from 4 knee surgeries, blowing out both his knees in June playing softball, ruptured patella tendons in both knees. He says it was in leg braces for 16 weeks. I believe that all is in fact true, dear listener. And then, as Matt pointed out, he said he is happy to be in Hartford, Connecticut because it is in the insurance capital of the world. And thanks to his insurance, he does not have $80,000 in doctor's bills right now. And then he later thanks Jared David for filling in, and he calls Jared a tremendous asset that Ring of Honor was lucky to have, which I thought was a very nice way of,
It was very nice, yes.
But yeah, Lenny is back, and yeah, health insurance. What a world. Good things all health insurance related problems have been solved now with Obamacare, right, Matt? I don't live in America, so I just assume it's all good now. No one pays for anything.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the second match on the show. Austin Aries defeated Eddie Edwards via pinfall in 7 minutes 21 seconds after hitting the 450 splash. The ROH Newswire wrote at this time that you'll notice that in the Hartford lineup that Eddie Edwards is set to make his ROH debut. Edwards looked great on the November Noah tour that Bryan Danielson was on. ROH officials will have high hopes for Edwards, and he will get a chance to make a big splash as he takes on Austin Aries. If Edwards can defeat Aries, he will immediately earn a roster spot. So that quote from the ROH Newswire, that kind of sounds like, I mean, I have no idea of knowing this, but it'd be interesting. I wonder if Bryan Danielson like literally recommended him. Like, hey, I was on this tour with Noah. Maybe him or maybe Nigel has been doing Noah tours. I could imagine one of them saying like, hey, you should give this guy a shot, because we've established lately, like from quotes I've read from other things, that like a lot of who got into Ring of Honor at this point, because Gabe was busy, was basically his trusted wrestlers telling him, I've worked this guy recently. He's good. You should give him a shot. So
yeah.
This is Edwards' Ring of Honor debut, at least his main card debut, but I think honestly this is his debut period. And this feels like a random TV match for this era in length and quality. From like it's a strong average, I would say. It's something, if you saw this on a Raw or Impact at this time, you wouldn't be mad at it, but you also wouldn't be in love with it. You'd forget about it immediately. I would say Aries gives Edwards a fair bit of offense here, but Eddie doesn't really show anything in terms of personality or even style here. Like, I think if you watch this match and this is your first exposure to Eddie Edwards, you go, oh, this is a pretty solid, competent wrestler, but you don't really know what makes him special. Maybe he was still working on his personality. Maybe there isn't anything but even like stylistically, he just comes off as a fairly good generic wrestler, decent body, decent size for an indie, at least compared to Austin Aries. I mean, body compared to, Aries has a great body, but the height, you're always going to look tall next to Austin Aries. The thing that stands out for me most in terms of his look is his awful haircut, which I remembered after all these years. And I say this as someone who's had a few awful haircuts in his day. His head, if you haven't seen it, was shaved on all sides, so like the sides and the back, and the top was all in these little braids. Like 2024 Bryan Danielson would look at this haircut and go, that's too much for me. Like that's
there was kind of some similarity to like British Bulldog in like the early 90s, kind of like those kinds of braids almost.
Yeah, and I would also say Eddie also does one of the more blatant thigh slaps I've seen in a match on a leg lariat. But then I realized we just watched that Kikutaro match on our recent show, which had the most blatant thigh slaps in the history of pro wrestling. So you know what? He gets a pass on those. But yeah, I'd actually like when I talked about like loading the show up with news. I don't have much to say about this match either. It was a perfectly fine 7 minutes. Edwards looked fine, but you would not see that this guy was going to be, he's going to have like a near 20 years after this run, like he's going to be a very good wrestler. I would just say, oh yeah, he looks okay. He looks solid. And it was a decent match, I would say.
Yeah, I would say also similar things, but I think maybe I would frame it a little more positively than you in the sense of, yes, I wouldn't have watched this and thought, oh, that's a future ROH champion. But compared to some of the debuts we've seen for some of these other kind of quote-unquote generic indie guys, I do think Edwards stood out as far as just being more solid. I think Aries gave him a lot enough to where he looked good and it kind of seemed like a worthy competitor to this former world champion in this, fairly short match. So I think that I had a more positive takeaway, even though I kind of felt similar to you about the quality of the match. It was decent. That's kind of all they were really going for. And I don't think you were going to get a really dramatic match when Edwards' opponent was Austin Aries, who they weren't going to just go even with this noob kind of.
Yeah.
But I think that Edwards did enough where it said, oh, I understand why they brought him back. I understand that, why he made a bigger impression than maybe some of the other guys that have sort of debuted in his shoes where it was, I get why, even though Gabe liked Jason Blade a lot, I get why Edwards continued past the level that Jason Blade was on, I guess is what I would say, based on this one match.
Yeah, and obviously they saw something in him, like giving him a little bit longer than the standard ROH 5-minute squash or less, having Aries give him a bit more offense than you'd expect. And even like you just mentioned, Jason Blade's a great comparison. Jason Blade's been in and out of Ring of Honor for a while now. Eddie Edwards, this is his first match. He's already got like a better first match than Jason Blade is. Jason Blade's getting Pele Primo and he's getting to win, but I'd rather, if I was a wrestler, get the extra 3 minutes and get to work Austin Aries and lose, because I think I will get to show more there.
And Eddie, if I'm remembering correctly, he doesn't really start getting traction in ROH until they pair him with Davey Richards sometime in 2008, right? It's not like he becomes a big deal in ROH in 2007. It takes a while, but he'll get there.
Yeah, he gets used semi-regularly, like when they're in the North, like in New England and that kind of stuff. But yeah, and he's not really entrenching himself in the company until the American Wolf stuff. But a couple quick notes I had for this match that are just about goofy things. Before the match, the fans are chanting, but they're so out of sync. Some fans are chanting for Aries at different times. So Aries literally tells them all to be quiet in like a friendly way, and then he gets to restart the chant altogether. And to be fair, they chant a lot better after he does that. And I also love that one point they do the old, which they do for almost every match, which I find kind of annoying. The old, if you put Aries in a head scissors, he pops out and drop kicks you spot. But I did really like in this match, it is so well known that as soon as Eddie Edwards puts Aries in the head scissors, the commentary is like, oh, you can't do that. And then when Aries drop kicks him, he then says, you gotta watch the tapes. So I love that. which feels like in a way kind of a weird dick move, because it's Aries calling for that spot, right? But he's calling for that spot, and then he's now telling the wrestler, like, you don't study things. But like in non-kayfabe, you're calling for the spot that makes people look stupid, right?
But I do kind of like the idea, like if someone's an ROH newbie, they're going to get fooled by it and no one else will,
Yeah. It would be great if Eddie, when he says you gotta watch the tapes, if Eddie was like, I can't afford it, okay? Like, I'm waiting for a sale. Just stuff like that. It would be good. But then you'd know he's a real one. But after the match, we return backstage to find Jimmy Jacobs, who has done makeup to resemble the blood dripping out of the side of his eye that legitimately happened at the last show. Jacobs says, life's funny. He doesn't think his parents raised him to be a professional wrestler. His father is a federal judge. His brother has his PhD in math, and Jimmy fights for a living. He hurts people and he doesn't think twice about it. He's bled more times than any one man should. He says most men fear their own blood, but he's come to know it, comparing it to a hot shower on a winter's day. He talks about the iron smell of it, not being able to open your eyes when the blood clogs them. Jimmy says he's bled so much that he lives in a blood-tinted world, but the one thing he sees clearly is the diamond in the rough of this world, Lacey. The one beautiful thing left in this world, and in Chicago, B.J. Whitmer took an 8-inch nail and drove it into her face. Jimmy covered her up, took her to the back, and when he unwrapped her head and saw her for the first time in a long time, the sight of blood sickened him. When Lacey opened her eyes, she saw the world how Jimmy sees it, how no one should see it, through a crimson window. The plastic surgery might cover her scars, but the emotional damage BJ did to her is unforgivable. If Jimmy could go back, he'd stand there and let BJ stab him 1,000 times instead of Lacey once. Jimmy says he and Lacey will be changed forever, and he ends by saying that this weekend he will change BJ and Colt Cabana forever. For the rest of their lives, they'll have a blood-stained world. This was very emo, very overwrought, but I also thought it was kind of a good promo. Like I think it could be both.
It was definitely a good promo. It was definitely a good promo, but I thought it was made less intense and serious by the fact that Jimmy was chewing gum. It's like chewing gum. That's what like arrogant heels do during their promos, not intense emotional heels.
Yeah, like he's cutting what should be like, in some ways the most serious promo of his ROH career, where this is really part of like the shift of him into the more emo, kind of like a hint of way off in the future, the Age of the Fall thing to come, where he's much more dour. And yeah, he's chewing goddamn gum. He's got his Hubba Bubba or whatever in his mouth the whole promo. But,
oh man, I hope it was Hubba Bubba. Yeah, then he should have blown some bubbles during the promo. That would have been even better.
Just the bobble pops. He's like, I've been living in a Hubba Bubba state tinted world. Everything is vaguely pink. But next up we have Adam Pearce with Shag Hagedorn in his corner, defeating Delirious via pinfall in 6 minutes 11 seconds after hitting him with brass knuckles. This was our third straight short match to start the show, and our third straight match that felt kind of like we were watching a not particularly high stakes episode of a 2006 ROH TV show that didn't exist at this time, I would say. Like, what'd you think about this?
Yeah, I agree. It's like it was short, but it was also our third straight match that was, pretty much all action at the very least. They took advantage of the short run time to pack a lot in. The match is basically all about how Pearce and Hagedorn are dastardly heels. So I guess your tolerance for that will determine how much you would have enjoyed this match. Just a lot of cheating, a lot of, Pearce attacking Delirious before the bell so he doesn't get to go crazy, taking it right outside. Spots where Pearce is choking Delirious on the floor with the tassels. Spots where Pearce puts him in a camel clutch and says, I'm going to make him humble, and not being the only person on this show to make that joke because this is late 2006 and it's all anyone wanted to talk about. And then there was a spot where Delirious, he drops back for a pinning combo out of the camel clutch, but Hagedorn pulls the ref out of the ring. And, whenever that happens, I'm like, why is this allowed? It's just funny to me because I know it's broken record, but ROH is supposed to be the wrestling promotion, and you're just allowed in a normal match, just pull the referee out of the ring. I would love to see that happen in like a boxing match. Just the referee's counting, he's almost up to 10, and just somebody just yanks the referee out of the ring. And then the referee's just like, what are you doing? I got to go back in and count, as opposed to not just ruining the whole match. But anyway, there's just a lot of, there's more Hagedorn distraction. Delirious goes for the panic attack, and Hagedorn grabs Delirious's leg, and so Pearce attacks him there. Then Delirious does a small package. The referee is distracted again. And then after he finally hits the panic attack, he goes to the top rope. Hagedorn interferes while trying to throw in brass knuckles, and Delirious stops him, but the ref is distracted, and then Pearce pulls out a second pair of brass knuckles and hits Delirious as he comes off the top rope and gets that pin. So it's like, it's all about the Pearce and Hagedorn hijinks, and if you're okay with that, this was a pretty entertaining match because it was all action. I am starting to enjoy Pearce's matches a little bit more. I think he's kind of getting a little bit more dynamic, and I do think Hagedorn plays a good role in his matches, but again, this was just total heel shtick. That's what the match was. Do you like that? Then I guess you'll be okay with this. If you're like, I don't want any of that in ROH, then you're not going to like this match.
I will agree with you and say I like Adam Pearce a bit more on rewatch than I remembered liking him at the time. Like, he was really good in the CZW feud storyline, and his matches are generally he always does a little bit more than I remember him doing, and he definitely adds something different to the shows, and he's cut like 2 or 3 really good promos during his short tenure in Ring of Honor. And considering that he spent much of this time sucked into the Jim Cornette vortex, as I will call it, you know that he's produced a decent amount of good entertaining moments. I think it's more than I remembered him offering. I thought this match was fine. It was low average, like you said. It was another match that was all action. There were a couple neat spots, like Pierce attacking Delirious before the bell, where Delirious, before every match at this point in his career, always just held out his arm for like a handshake and just stayed motionless, crouched in the corner. And Adam Pearce just starts kicking him before the bell while he's motionless. And you'd start thinking, well, every heel should do that, right? Like, that just makes sense. And there was kind of a neat spot where Delirious goes to crossbody Pierce over the top rope to the floor, but instead Pierce just holds on, and the two almost go over the top, but they stay on the right side, and then Pierce just drops into a backbreaker. I thought, oh, that's kind of a neat spot.
I couldn't tell if that was ad-lib because they couldn't get over, or if that was the planned spot.
Me neither, honestly. Me neither. But either way, I enjoyed the end result. But yeah. Mostly what we get is, like Matt said, a lot of interference by Shane Hagedorn. I mean, a lot. Like, if we just go by interference per minute, this might be the most interference-dense match in Ring of Honor history, since it was only like 6 minutes. He pulls the ref out of the ring, as Matt said, during a pinfall. He gets attacked by Delirious on the outside when he's staying too close. He distracts the ref. He struggles with Delirious on the top rope. All this stuff. And I felt like this was one of those matches where, on a good show, it's perfectly fine to have something like this, like a short match prolonging a feud that's kind of filled with fuckery and interference. But when you're 3 matches into the start of a show, and by the time this match ends, we're almost 35 minutes into the DVD, I do kind of feel like at this point in the show, you kind of have wanted to have seen something a bit more substantial than this at this point. But on an island in isolation, it's perfectly acceptable. Lenny, at one point on commentary call, says that Pierce is Shane Hagedorn's master. I just wrote notes. Are they in a sexual relationship now? But I guess that was the subtext they kept trying to do.
There definitely was this kind of I don't know, I don't know about S&M, maybe a little bit, but domination kind of deal. Yeah, I think so.
And the other note I have is Brian Alvarez at this time wrote in Figure 4 Weekly, Shane Hagedorn is now not only working the main show, but feuding with Delirious, who Gabe has plans for in 2007. I had to look it up. I don't know if I don't know if Gabe does have plans for Delirious in 2000. Delirious is like a guy who, he gets wins and he trades wins and losses. He's always in the mix in the mid card, upper mid card. But in terms of big notable feuds or big wins or anything, I don't know if Gabe has I'm racking my brain trying to think of the specific plans he could have possibly had for Delirious in 2007, because I don't think he does a ton. I think he has a bigger 2006 than a 2007.
No, definitely, he definitely does. 100%.
Yeah. So after the match, Pierce and Hagedorn go to leave, but Pele Primo from out of nowhere grabs Hagedorn and throws him back into the ring, where Delirious pile drives him. Pele and Delirious hug as Pele holds Hagedorn's top of the class trophy, so they continue to build the Pele Primo Shane Hagedorn feud. And that brings us to a match I have a lot to say about, if I didn't have much to say about the first 3. Mixed tag team match. BJ Whitmer and Daisy Hayes defeated Jimmy Jacobs and Mercedes Martinez in 7 minutes, 34 seconds when Hayes pinned Martinez after a top rope splash. So the story of this match is that Lacey is not on the show due to getting spiked by Whitmer in the face on the last show, but she's dug into her pocketbook and hired Mercedes tonight to help take him and Daisy out. Where to start? I was ready to praise this match, and then the end happened. This is a rare for a Ring of Honor mixed tag match. They work it in tornado tag rules, so there's no tags. And the middle of the match is really 2 matches, in fact. Is Hayes and Martinez are wrestling in the ring, and Whitmer and Jacobs are brawling in the crowd. And ROH does something they almost never do, which is a picture-in-picture. They do a small video box in the corner showing the crowd brawl between Jacobs and Whitmer. And then they do something I don't know if they've ever done, which is they keep the picture-in-picture going for the entire crowd brawl. And in a way, it's good, because sometimes I've wanted this this for matches like this where there's multiple points of action going on. But I felt it hilarious that in a promotion that has so often treated women so poorly, the rare time they do this is when two women are in the ring. Like, it's almost like they were like, shit, we can't trust the women to hold their attention. Like, we got to show them something else. And honestly, during the segment with the two separate matches in and out of the ring, the women's part wasn't amazing, but I thought it was more exciting than the crowd brawl, because I thought the crowd brawl was really boilerplate. Like, the biggest spot was just Jimmy going to some chairs. In the ring, there's like a great spot where Mercedes hits her really good brain buster. And I felt sad because if you watch that spot, the three sides of the ring where the crowd brawl aren't happening are watching the women's match, but no one on the side of the ring where the crowd brawl is happening is watching it at all. Like, every single head is turned to Jimmy Jacobs and BJ Whitmer because they're brawling right near them. I was just like, this is such ROH women's wrestling in a nutshell, where even when the women get a chance to wrestle, they don't really get a chance somehow. But something happens.
I don't think that I don't take that the picture in picture as a knock, like a negative in terms of how ROH treated the women. I think in any other like match previously, they would have just ignored the women completely almost, except for like one or two quick shots while the guys brawled. So I actually think this was them trying to give a little bit more kind of attention and credit to the women compared to what they normally do.
That's an interesting way. Like, you are simultaneously more like optimistic and pessimistic to me. You're saying like, look, I think this is better because they gave women more of an opportunity than I think they would have. Like, you think your floor expectation was even lower than mine. So yeah, if you view it that way, which I can actually see your logic, then yeah, this actually is a win. But I felt like this match had a real energy to it. Like, it's a chaotic, sloppy, scrambly energy, but it did have energy. It didn't feel like a B-show level effort. It felt like these four people definitely sat in the back before the match and thought about what neat things they could do in a mixed tag. Like, early on, they had each of the women do dives to the floor on their male opponents. And for the first half of this match, I thought they were going to do something I've seen in mixed tags before, where the women hit the men with a few spots, but the men never get to hit the women, even if they attempt to. But that does change in the second half, where they start having more free reign for the men to hit the women. And look, intergender wrestling is always a hot button topic. This is an issue I can see elements of on both sides. Like, on one hand, if we're talking about true gender equality, then in a perfect world, not just should intergender wrestling be a thing, it should be true back and forth with not just women doing spots to men, but men doing spots to women. But on the other hand, we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world that has basically a forever long history of gender inequality. And while women can absolutely physically abuse men, it has happened. It does happen. There's far more of a history of men physically abusing women, and therefore there's far more of an implication and painful memories and uncomfortable issues brought up whenever you have men do man-on-woman violence, even acted out like this. I mean, hell, Matt, one of the men in this match recently got charged with assaulting his girlfriend, BJ Whitmer. So, and don't think that didn't make watching this match more uncomfortable with what we're going to talk about in a second. I guess I'll say, if you ask me to really nail down my opinion on this topic, a topic which my opinion has evolved over the years, I will say I think true intergender wrestling, where men and women trade spots, can be done tastefully and respectfully, but you need a company to kind of earn that trust. And Ring of Honor, the company that literally started out having an instance of man-on-woman violence on every show, so long we kept a running tally of it, I don't think they've earned that trust. Especially because, let's face it, like, part of the reason a lot of people book intergender in this era, I think it's lesser now, but part of the main reasons people book intergender in this period, and why some still do, is because it ties into our real history, and it feels shocking and taboo for a man to hit a woman, and maybe, quite frankly, a few non-well-adjusted male fans probably enjoy seeing that. But with all that said, because I felt I did have to address that, if I ignore that, if I shut that part of my brain off and just think of the match, I think they did some neat spots mixing the genders, like the dives at the start. They also had Mercedes and Jacobs do a double team fisherman's buster on Whitmer, and that's Martinez's finisher. I thought that was cool. They had Daisy turn a Mercedes and Jacobs double suplex attempt on her into a double DDT. They had Whitmer exploder Martinez and Jacobs together, which looked like it could have killed someone. Little did I know that we were just a couple spots away from him almost killing somebody. And like I said before, this match was sloppy. But it had lots of energy, and with spots like this, it felt like they put a lot of thought into what they were going to do. Like, they had thought of a bunch of like intricate, like cool spots. Like, hey, we're going to try and give the crowd something. And then the end comes, which is probably not the intended end. This match was probably not supposed to be the fourth straight short match, but the end does come. Whitmer goes, and he just destroys Martinez with a running lariat. And I mean literally destroys. If you watch closely, you can see when Mercedes lands on her back, her arms are in what they call a fencing response, which if you don't know what a fencing response is, if you see it often, like not often, but in like boxing, MMA, real fights where someone's knocked really unconscious, occasionally their limbs will just jut out in front of them straight, rigid, even though they are completely out cold, like this defensive response. And that is happening here. Her arms are just rigidly for a moment sticking straight out, even though she's clearly just unconscious. Whitmer covers her. Jimmy breaks it up by jumping off the top rope. Whitmer then hoists Jimmy up on his shoulders like a fireman's carry, and he stands in the corner for a while so Daisy Hayes can awkwardly balance on Jimmy's back, jump off, and she hits a horrible-looking splash that was either horrible because she was trying to jump a fair distance off someone's back, or because maybe she was trying not to hurt Martinez, who I don't know if she was still completely unconscious or not, but either way, they cover, and then they end the match. And that alone would annoy me. And I know this is a bit long, but I just want to get to this last part. This is really what annoyed me. The ref then instantly waves people from the back. And as soon as he counts 3, we get some very panicked men, and someone is even coming with a med kit. And soon the other refs, and I think Terry Silken even, I noticed, come over to check on her, and there's a lot of concern. But as all these people come out, immediately after the bell, so does Brent Albright, because they have an angle to shoot that they clearly planned out before the match started. Brent Albright attacks BJ Whitmer, and again, I'm sure they had the angle planned out, but what it results in is you have Brent Albright and BJ Whitmer brawling inches from Mercedes Martinez, who, as we'll get to in a second, according to the Observer, had no ability at this point to move her arms or feeling in her arms, and in fact would not until much later in the hospital. And all during this, you can see people panicking, but then you can also see them fucking rolling and dragging a person who can't feel or move their arms, for all they know might have a broken fucking neck. They're like rolling her just because they're in such a hurry to get her out of the ring while this angle is happening. And what are the wrestlers doing in the ring as this happens? They're doing their pre-planned angle where Brent Albright holds Stacey Hayes so Jimmy can spike her, get revenge for what happened to Lacey, except BJ recovers enough from the beatdown to defend her, so Jimmy spikes Whitmer instead. And at this point, like they've rolled Mercedes Martinez out of the ring, and they're like helping her to the back. I thought this was one of the more uncomfortable things I've watched in wrestling in some time. Like, I have some sympathy for wrestlers not knowing when someone is hurt, and you don't always know. You don't always make the best decisions when calling audibles. I have a lot of sympathy for that. Like, when Jimmy was on the top rope and he does the flying elbow to break up the BJ pin of Mercedes right after, like, there might have not been a way he could have even known at that point that Martinez was knocked out. Whitmer might not even known. I mean, he probably should have noticed, but who knows? It would happen quickly. But to them have to do another spot to a person who was clearly out of it, and then do this angle afterwards, almost literally on top of her when she's clearly in a serious situation, and most importantly, to have people just roll her and like push her out of the ring, like, it's fucking horrible. Like, it's easy to watch now knowing that she turns out to be okay, but it just came off as so callous and dangerously rinky-dink and unprepared on how they handled this. And they got so fucking lucky that this situation didn't turn out much worse. And I have more to say, but like, Matt, I should give it to you. But like, again, it's just like a tale of two things, right? Like, interesting match, and then just one of the worst injuries we've ever seen on this show.
I'd like to hear honestly what you say before I do what I'm going to say. But I will ask, did you, like, before you read about this and did you remember that this had happened from like way back when?
I did not remember. And in fact, I know something happened to her afterwards, but I didn't even realize how serious it was until I then read the newsletters afterwards.
Right. Because that's what I was saying. That's what I was saying. Like, when I was writing my review of this match, I didn't really factor this in because I didn't remember, like it was, and then you go back and look, and then you're like, oh shit, that happened. And then you got to go back and watch it again,
Yeah, and in fact, that we will get to. Some people live even didn't know this was not an angle. So
yeah, I don't think it was super obvious even watching on DVD unless you already knew. Yeah.
I will say that, which is, I feel like the wrestler should have had more information, but I will say, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Where it's one of those things where if you know what happened and then watch the last few minutes, it becomes very obvious. But if you don't know what happened, you might pick up something, but you won't see it as much.
Yeah, like my review of this match was not written with factoring in that this happened. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but if you do know what's happening, then you really will notice like the arms rigidly sticking out, or how panicked people are right afterwards, things like that. But yeah, there's also so much action going on, and the camera's not always focusing on her. You won't necessarily notice much at all if you're not looking for it. But so yeah, I would just say the other thing I want to add, Matt, is I would say the sad part of this too is this is Mercedes Martinez's last match in Ring of Honor until the Tony Khan owned era. Like, she's briefly in the Vulture Squad stable a year down the road, but I don't think she has a match. And she's like one of the best women's wrestlers on the scene. I thought she looked good here. And I thought in like all 3 matches this year in Ring of Honor, she not only looked good, she was over. She gets like, I know they're in the New England area where she's from,
but not when they had the show in Manhattan. They weren't in the New England area, and she still got over.
Yeah, and they chant for her before the match. They chant for her at one point during the match, and like, she just deserves so much better all around. And before I throw it to you, then I'll just read the couple of quick notes I have, which is the Observer wrote, the scary moment of the show was in a mixed tag. BJ Whitmer and DC Hayes were facing Jimmy Jacobs and Mercedes Martinez. Whitmer hit Martinez with a hard lariat and knocked her out, and she may have gotten a stinger and did get a concussion. They went right to the finish with Hayes pinning her. They didn't go quite right to the finish. After the match, she was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance and had no feeling or movement in her arms. However, by the end of the night, she had regained full movement. And then someone from a PW Torch Live report who didn't give their name wrote, good match. Wondering on the condition of Mercedes, though, might have been legit, but including her in the finish makes me think it wasn't. Which again, it's like, that's the thing. It's like, she shouldn't have been included in the finish, or they should have just covered her again immediately when it became something was wrong. But instead they did an extra spot. But so yeah, like, that's the thing. Like, that is terrifying, because think about that. Like it's sometimes someone gets knocked out, but then they instantly recover consciousness. So you can at least say, okay, they can tell them, okay, like, I can feel things. I should be okay in some respect. According to the Dave Meltzer report, she didn't recover feeling or movement in her arms till like later that night in the hospital. Like, so when you watch people handle her, you have to realize, like, for all they know at that point, she has a broken neck, maybe. Like, they don't know. Yeah. And they're rolling her and they're not putting her on a stretcher. Like, it's just, like I said before, they got really lucky here, I think.
They did get really lucky. And I mean, obviously it's funny because you talk about the ethical issues and just like the depiction of man on woman violence and the intergender wrestling, but also, like, there might actually be more of an actual physical danger when there's man on woman wrestling too. And obviously, especially when you're wrestling, this like hard and stiff style that they were into on the indies at this point, and probably still now, right? So like, I don't know, it's complicated. I guess you can't necessarily blame what happened to Mercedes Martinez on the fact that this was an intergender situation. I mean, it could happen to anybody, right? And we've seen it happen to men, obviously, plenty of times. But it adds another wrinkle to it, I guess, is what you might say about it.
Yeah.
The match itself, when I first watched it, I just reviewed it as a match, and I was sort of like, well, if you could put the intergender stuff to the side, if depending on your tolerance of it and all that, this was a really crazy and memorable match in a way that I wasn't necessarily expecting when I watched it. When I put it on, it was just, they did a lot of crazy stuff. Obviously, Mercedes looked really good until the injury, and I guess I appreciated, like, in one sense, that they were like, we're not just going to do just the generic crowd brawl. We're going to add this extra element at the end of the match to make this something kind of special. It just went awry, but it was exciting. Like, I can't lie, it was an exciting match that got a lot of heat, and didn't have a lot of stuff that got a lot of heat lately. So I did find it entertaining to watch when I was watching it. It's just weird to think about knowing what happened.
Yeah, I enjoyed the match. Again, it's one of the only few matches on the show where I felt like they were really putting in like an A show level effort on a B show, like in terms of like just their imagination and their energy. And it's a shame, because I think if they probably had a few more minutes to go, I think this match could have been pretty, like, I think this match would have been like not just good, but maybe like pretty darn good. I'd add a darn in there probably if they had a few more minutes, but it ends the way it does. It turns from being what probably would have been one of the highlights of the night to a real bummer moment, if you know what's happening. But So the segment continues even after all what I described. After Martinez is taken to the back, Whitmer's bleeding. Jimmy is spiking him more until Colt Cabana's music hits. He runs in. He cleans house of Jacobs and Albright, eventually grabbing the spike, and he scares Albright and Jimmy to ringside. Colt then drops the spike onto the ring bell to ring it for the next match, which was impressive. It just perfectly tings just from him dropping it. Or as Colt says, the belt's from Gunner. Let's go. Because of course, Gunner Scott was Brent Albright's brief name in WWF, WWE. And that brings us to Colt Cabana defeating Brent Albright via pinfall in 13 minutes, 35 seconds using a cradle. Matt, what'd you think about this?
This is another match where, like you said, definitely wasn't an A-show effort, but I think I liked it more than I expected to. I thought that the early comedy with Colt was kind of better than I think it's been. I kind of get sick of it a lot of the times, but I enjoyed Albright's reactions to it. Like like Cabana uses his goofiness to stop Albright's mat wrestling. He baits him to grab his leg, then tricked him to grabbing the other leg so he can roll Brent up. And Albright kind of leans into it, right? He's arguing with the crowd that he does not suck, and he's grabbing his head in frustration. And at one point, Albright grabs Colt's arm, so Colt sneezes in his face to break the hold, and he even uses the ref to trick Brent into allowing himself to be taken down, and then leapfrogs over the ref to put Brent face to face with the ref. And I thought all that stuff was enjoyable. I think the middle portion of the match, where Albright is methodically working over Cabana and his neck and all that stuff, got kind of dull. It wasn't great, though. There was a spot where Albright does his 619 knee thing and hits it, but then Cabana immediately pops up and clotheslines Albright down. So that was an unusual amount of fighting spirit by Colt, I would say, in a match like this. But then, Cabana makes his typical comeback, and he hits the cabrata. He actually goes for the butt, but Albright moves, and Cabana lands on the middle rope, and so Cabana leaps off with the butt from the middle rope, which I thought was actually a really well done spot that I haven't seen before. I like that. I thought there was another cool spot where he goes for the missile drop kick, but Albright moves, and so Colt rolls through, and Albright bellies him overhead into the corner. I thought that was a cool spot. And then you get to the point where Colt misses a clothesline. Albright hits a half Nelson suplex and locks in the crowbar, and I expected that to be it. Because they've been putting over the crowbar so much, but Cabana tries to roll through, Albright holds on, Cabana tries to roll out again, Albright still holds on, and then Colt finally makes the ropes, and, Albright won't release the hold until he has till 5, and then Albright tries to whip Cabana in, but Cabana gets one of those wacky roll-ups for the flash pin. Honestly, my biggest complaint about this match is that I think that's the wrong finish. Once you get to Cabana rolling through over and over again and Albright still holding on to the crowbar, I think Cabana should have just lost to the crowbar. I mean, they weren't building Cabana up for some big title match. Albright was the one on the come up. I think that Albright should have won this match, especially given how they laid out the final few minutes. I think this would have been better if Cabana had just, after a lot of struggle, just eventually tapped out to the crowbar. But otherwise, I actually thought this was all right. I kind of was entertained by it, except for the middle.
I was just not in a good mood after the last match. I want to just fully disclose my frame of mind. I wasn't in a good frame of mind for this match because I watched these two matches back to back. And on top of that, I obviously, listeners of the show will know I haven't been a big Brent Albright fan on this rewatch. But with all that being said, I will say this match ended up being mostly a Colt Cabana match. Not that Albright didn't have offense, as you kind of helped establish by recapping the match. But I mean the sense of, I feel like sometimes in wrestling, someone's comedy fills up whatever personality gaps their opponent is leaving in a match. And Albright at this point has so little personality that Cabana's comedy and his personality kind of dominates this match. And although like you said, Albright does kind of play along, he does act outraged, he doesn't stone face. He plays the straight man kind of. But in fact, I would say though, in the first 5 minutes of this match, it just felt like a lot of the match was just the two guys, mostly Colt, reacting to the fans. Even though they probably didn't do it that much, it just feels that way. And this was when I started to notice one of those matches where they were really reacting to the crowd, and there were some people being smartasses. Early on, the fans chant, "You got fired" at Albright, and Colt gets on the mic to say, whoa, what me and Lacey did was not sexual harassment. I didn't get fired. So stuff like that. And it just felt like I've been surprised on these early Brent Albright Ring of Honor appearances that the fans have liked him a bit more than I remembered. This show, it was like the opposite. Like they hated him a bit more. And granted, he had just done a heel angle, but like there are people, I'm hearing people making Gunner Scott things and like you got fired and all this shit. Like they're kind of getting on his ass a bit here. But and like at one point, you hear a fan scream like "cut a promo, Albright!" Like they're making fun of his ability to cut a promo, and they're calling him the F slur for gay people and Chinese. Like they're pretty pissed off at him. But anyway, Colt did do a bunch of comedy spots that I don't see him do at all or very often. Like you pretty much nailed them all. I, like you, really liked like the flying butt that missed, and then it just seamlessly turned into him doing basically a springboard butt off the second turnbuckle. I like you. I thought that was actually a pretty cool spot. The one, and I appreciate whenever he changes up the comedy spots to anything that's a little bit different and novel is good with me. But the ones that I did have a bone to pick with was the one you mentioned where, so like Matt mentioned, there's a spot where Colt has Albright on his back and Colt's standing over him and he's twisting one of his ankles. No, it's all the opposite. Albright's standing over Colt. Colt's on his back, and Albright's twisting one of Colt's ankles. And Colt like wiggles his other foot. It's like, hey, how about you take this one? I'm going to offer you the other foot. And Albright then takes Colt's other foot, and when he does that, Colt like slaps his feet together as he does it and like pinches Albright's fingers between the feet. So it's like a funny, goofy spot. But I was thinking, as a wrestler in Albright's position, why would you ever take the other foot? Like the best case scenario is you get a hold of one of his feet, which is the scenario you start with. That'd be like, Matt, if you and I went to an ice cream place and we both bought like vanilla cones. And as soon as I was like, Matt, let's trade ice cream cones. If we bought the same thing, something is up if I'm offering, like, let's trade. We ordered the same thing. Like, the most you can get is what you started with. Like, isn't that suspicious that I'm asking to trade?
Well, the idea is that these are big, dumb, meathead guys that Colt is smarter than.
Yeah, I mean, that does work. So, yeah, the match itself was very average. Colt's comedy filled the match, gave it some sparkle. I wasn't in the mood for it, but, when Albright controlled, like you said, I thought it got plotting in the middle, but that's par for the course with Albright here. It's the usual stuff when Albright's on offense. Some plotting stuff, some basic submissions, a little bit of clubbering, 2 or 3 nice big suplexes late in the match. And I do agree with you. I thought it was weird that Albright had Colt in the crowbar for so long because I think so far all we've seen is it like it's like a pretty quick tap out, and they let like Colt survive in it for so long. It's like, to me, if a submission normally finishes matches almost instantaneously, if you're gonna let someone like stay in it for a full minute, it needs to be like a really big match then, because like. Yeah, this didn't seem like a big enough match to like. Yeah, he either should have won, Albright should have won, or they shouldn't have had Colt survive like so long in this. But I guess they were just trying to add something to the match. I guess some intrigue. The last thing I'll say is this is a note from the Observer. Dave got. He wrote, "Expect Brent Albright to be booked largely in matches less than 10 minutes if he works singles," which is funny because he did that. He wrote this comment on after a match that was 13:35, and also I wonder if that's like an acknowledgement that maybe Brent gets kind of ponderous if he works longer matches. Like the idea that someone clearly, probably Gabe, told him like, yeah, Brent's going to be starting working. If he's working singles, it'll be less than 10 minutes.
Yeah, but that should immediately say that the person's not a good fit for ROH then, right? If you can't work a plus 10-minute match, like that's the whole point of ROH, right?
Yeah, and we see them. They start to slot him eventually into a trio, but yeah, it's like maybe I'm not analyzing this right. Maybe that's part of like we're just going to book him really strong. He's going to beat people in under 10 minutes. But I took it as more as no, we're kind of like we just don't want to put him in long matches.
If it's really that they don't trust him, then that's just like then they've changed what ROH is, right? But yeah maybe it's more the other one that they're just like we're gonna book him strong and not and it's nothing to do with our analysis or our assessment of his ability to have long matches.
So that brings us to the Kings of Wrestling, Chris Hero and Claudio Castagnoli. defeating the Briscoes, Jay and Mark, in 1509 when Hero pinned Jay after Jay was hit by Larry Sweeney.
So I know you're going to recap it first, but I do want to interrupt you for one thing. This has got to be the laziest babyface turn in wrestling history. The Briscoes are just babyfaces now. Nothing happened. Yeah. They're wrestling heels. They're babyfaces. They have done nothing to change, to announce their change or explain their change. They are just babyfaces. And I mean, they work great as babyfaces. It's fine, but this was not a real turn.
Yeah, they literally went from feuding with two of the top babyfaces in the entire promotion, Homicide and Samoa Joe, being like the willing henchman for Jim Cornette, attacking Davey Richards in like a building on a video wire out of nowhere, to like now it is literally just without acknowledgement. They're just being positioned against heels and just being the Briscoes. And so Dave Prazak on commentary announces this as the final time the Kings of Wrestling will team together in Ring of Honor, which is not true. It happens the next night. But Dave openly says on commentary, Claudio is headed to WWE, and Chris Hero has made it known he has a special send-off plan for Claudio tomorrow night. So yeah, this, it was thought that Claudio was going to WWE. We'll get into, I guess I'll save that for Final Battle, the next show that, that changes, and Claudio's here to stay, so they have to pivot. They already, I think I read somewhere once that, they made the Kings drop the titles sooner than they expected because of the Claudio signing with WWE, but now they're going to be in this weird position of, well, it turns out Claudio's actually going to be here for a while. So, about the match, I just did a low-key rant, maybe I think on the last show, about being fatigued by the 2006 ROH tag team style, like the structure of so many of the matches being similar, and this was more of that. It was all action from start to finish, pretty much 15 minutes straight. Everyone worked pretty hard. I would say this is like a B plus show effort, like in a strong B. It wasn't what they would do on the biggest show, but they worked decently hard. There's a somewhat brief stretch where a face gets isolated, makes the hot tag. The final 5 minutes get a bit wilder, but it's just lacking any and all intangibles and story other than the interference at the very end. So I feel this way about this match. I feel about the way I feel about like a lot of 2006 RH tag matches and a lot of 2006 Briscoes tag matches, which is it's good in a way, but it doesn't grab me. It's like maybe a low 3.5 stars. I've just seen too much of this and too many of these kinds of matches, and not much else. It's just one of those things where, unfortunately, because the bar for just matches that have no story, that's just action for 15 minutes, because the standards for those matches always gets raised the quickest. It's just, these are the matches that age the worst. I always say that, but it's true. I did like Claudio doing this great forward head scissors takeover off the top turnbuckle, and I did love, it's not head scissors where basically you're kind of face down and you're just grabbing the guy with your feet and you're kind of flipping forwards. And I did like that Mark Briscoe did a great jumping, like almost leg lariat to someone as they were on the turnbuckles later. So there was a couple of fun literal high spots, as in they happened high. I enjoyed that. But the big thing, of course, was the interference and the non-backstage debut of Larry Sweeney. This is the first time he's in front of the fans. And maybe this is the second match in the last 3 matches where heels went out from outside interference, which, again, it happens occasionally in ROH. I don't mind it happening occasionally, but it's worth noting that they went to the well twice in short order on the show, and they will go into the outside interference changes of finish well at least one more time on this show. So they're going a bit into the fuckery. But overall, I actually don't have a ton to say about this match, like the nuts and bolts of it, because I just feel like I've seen a lot of this kind of match.
I wrote something pretty similar to you, and also wrote, like, it had action, definitely had action, did not have drama. I do think there was something there as far as the Briscoes working babyface for the first time in a while that I enjoyed, but just, things didn't really come together. You kind of named any of the spots I would have mentioned. I also do think they were leaving stuff in the tank because, I don't know how well you remember it, but I have a vivid memory of the match they have, a rematch the very next night, being significantly better. I hope my memory is correct, because then it would sort of explain why this one was sort of the B-show version. Do you remember the match at all from Final Battle?
I don't remember much, but I can say the reviews online are pretty positive for it. And, like, why wouldn't you put in a bigger effort on the next night in New York on a bigger show. Like I'd be shocked if it's not better than this, because you'd have to be crazy to not put a bigger. No offense to the 400 fans in Hartford, Connecticut, but you'd have to be crazy to not put in a bigger effort in New York.
And so I will say this. I feel confident saying this. It's definitely better than this match. Is it enough better to match my memory of it? That's what I'm sort of trying to remember. I remember that being like a great match, like one of the better tag team matches of the year. And I don't know. I'm curious to find out how it holds up, because this one I even remember from the time, people not saying much about, saying if anything it was maybe a little disappointing. Sweeney kind of was the highlight, and of course with Sweeney here, he shows up, he's hanging out with Hero, but he doesn't say much. It's sort of like, especially like the fans are just sort of left to be like, that's Larry Sweeney, but what's he doing? He's not really doing anything, He's so it's that's another thing they're saving for the next night, sort of allowing Larry Sweeney to announce his arrival and his intentions more clearly.
Yeah, and after the match, Sweeney and Hero hug and celebrate. Claudio seems confused as they walk far ahead of him, almost leaving him behind. So I guess we get a little bit of foreshadowing for what's coming next night. But then we then go backstage where Delirious is angrily banging against the wall. He cuts an angry promo in Delirious Ease about Adam Pearce and Shane Hagedorn. We hear him say it's not over and it's not going to end like that. So, the Delirious and Shane Hagedorn, Adam Pearce feud must continue. Non-title, 4-corner survival match. Bryan Danielson defeated Homicide.
I do just want to mention about the Delirious promo that he ends by saying "bum diddy whoa," which should have been his new T-shirt and possibly his new catchphrase.
Yeah, that would have been good.
It was bum diddly whoa, bum diddly whoa,
Bo diddly whoa. So now we have our non-title 4-corner survival match. Bryan Danielson defeated Homicide, Jimmy Rave, and Nigel McGuinness in 14:35 when he pinned McGuinness with a small package. As we mentioned earlier, this was supposed to be Samoa Joe in Jimmy Rave's place. It was building up, the Samoa Joe Nigel McGuinness match the next night, which also has to be moved because of Joe's knee injury. But Matt, what did you think about this match? Joe does appear late. What did you think about it? I mean, on paper, star-studded 4-way, but paper and plastic are different. I don't know what to say.
on plastic, this match
how was it on plastic, Matt?
It was basically all about building up these rivalries, these feuds. It was not about this match. This match sort of took a backseat to the matches that this match was supposed to be building. I get why they would do something like that, but let me ask you something. Do you think that having Bryan Danielson and Homicide in a sort of a not particularly high energy 4-way the night before their huge, greatly anticipated match adds to the main event of Final Battle or detracts from the main event of Final Battle?
I think what they did on this show, the angle they shot at the end, I think maybe adds a little bit of intrigue. But here's the thing I'll ask you, which is, I'll answer your question with a question, which is, what's the point of shooting like an injury heat angle the day before a show when you're a DVD product? You won't even have time to do a video wire showing this. It's in front of 400 fans. Like the idea of doing this is the logic you'd use for a TV promotion. Like, okay, we're going to do an injury angle on the last SmackDown, the pay-per-views in 2 days. Everyone's going to be watching SmackDown. You can't do that same logic with a DVD show, that where no one's going to see this, for it only, I mean, I guess it works for people that are watching home viewers like us, but
yeah, no, I agree.
This is an angle feels like you should have done maybe 3 shows ago if you really wanted to do it.
This feels like Burnout kind of booking, where it's like, we just don't know what to do with these guys. Because I don't think that it added anything. I don't think that match would have had one bit less heat, less, one iota less of heat, if they didn't do that angle. I don't think that they would have had any less of a reason to focus on the shoulder in that match if they didn't do this angle. And I think that having those two guys together in a way that's not that dramatic or exciting adds to the main event. So, I don't think this was productive booking if your goal was to build up the main event of Final Battle. But that said, as far as the match itself, I do think they did, a good job weaving in these feuds, whether it's, Nigel and Rave and Homicide and Danielson, but then also a little bit of Samoa Joe and Nigel at the end. A little bit of stuff with Homicide and Rave, because they had a match the previous month. So I didn't think it was bad like that, but I think this match was not. They were not trying to have the match that they could have had action-wise. There was some decent action near the end, but it's not like this was anywhere near like a top-tier four-corner survival match. And, it felt boilerplate at different times. Of course, there's a lot of parts of it that ended up almost being like a little tag match but with Raven Danielson against McGuinness and Homicide. We do get a moment of Danielson against Rave, but very, very little. Down the stretch is where they start actually having action. Nigel hits the hammerlock DDT on Rave and then goes to tag Homicide, but Danielson tags in, knocks Homicide off the apron. Eventually, Homicide takes Danielson out, clotheslines Rave, hot tags Homicide, and Homicide definitely does seem more energized than he has in a while this weekend. He knees Rave to the floor, onto Danielson, tope con hilos both of them. Nigel, of course, comes back in quickly, even though he's been beaten down for a while. He hits a big running European uppercut, short arm lariat. He goes to the Tower of London, but Danielson tries to break it up with the roaring forearm. But Nigel moves, and Danielson roaring forearms Rave. And then Nigel hits the Tower of London, gets a 2 count. And my favorite part of the match that I popped for, I don't know if you noticed this, Trevor, Nigel gets that arm submission on Jimmy Rave.
Oh, I didn't. I wish I noticed that.
I don't remember the last time we saw that arm submission. But Danielson breaks it up with the diving headbutt. Then Homicide cutters Danielson, goes for the cop killer. Danielson sends him out into the ring post, shoulder first. Homicide sells the shoulder, and that's when Samoa Joe comes out, checks on him. But back in the ring, Rave and Nigel continue to battle. Nigel hits the rebound lariat, but the ref is distracted. And then Nigel sees Joe out there, gets distracted, and he goes after Joe. And Danielson comes from behind and gets the small package for the win. So that last sequence was entertaining, but again, it never felt intensely exciting. One other spot that I didn't mention that I thought was pretty cool, though, was when Nigel went for the rebound lariat the first time against Rave, but Danielson was on the outside and he held Nigel in the rebound position so he couldn't swing back, and then Rave got to attack him while he was in the ropes. I really liked that spot. There was some good stuff with Danielson and McGuinness since we hadn't really seen a ton of that in a while. There was another spot where a moment where Danielson and Rave started to wrestle, and Leonard said that the match between Danielson and Rave put Rave on the map as a headliner in this company. That is not how I remember it going. Right? That was like the peak of Rave, and he started going downhill after that. But maybe that's just kind of a result of Leonard being gone for so long that he didn't realize how far down the card they had pushed Jimmy Rave. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how I would say about the match. It was very storyline heavy. Certainly wasn't a great match. Certainly wasn't what this could have been if these four guys were like, yeah, let's just go out there and kill it, right? They weren't trying to do that. They were saving themselves for the next night. They were trying to get over storylines. It was effective in that sense, but I'd say overall it was just, I would say, pretty good.
Yeah, I thought this was your absolute textbook example of a Friday night ROHB show. We have bigger matches tomorrow night, so let's take it easy 4-way. I think Nigel worked pretty hard, but otherwise, I thought the other three were on autopilot, particularly Bryan Danielson of all people. But I can't blame him given how hurt he was at this point and how important his match the next night was. But much like the tag before it, I've seen I've seen a million ROH tags that were like that match. I've seen a million ROH 4-ways like this, right down to them treating it like a tag match halfway through with the heels isolating one of the faces and doing the hot tag. There's a point later in the match where Nigel is getting a big near fall on someone, and Homicide just keeps staying on the apron, looking, just not even trying to break up the pin. He forgot it's not a tag match. I just thought as a match, this is very average. And I got to that point where I had to ask myself a question I've asked myself before, which is how much is this fatigue I'm having for a match like this is a normal ROH fan having at this point? Because I think I've mentioned this once long ago, but it's always that thing I have to ask myself as someone who's rewatching every single show. I've seen every single 4-way. I've seen every single tag match. So I'm noticing patterns, and I bet you most people were not buying every single show And maybe when I get mad about like, oh, this 4-way, it broke down to like a fake tag and all this stuff, and I've seen this happen so many times. If you're watching every third ROH show, every fourth ROH show, you're not seeing the pattern as often as I am. So maybe I'm being a bit harder on it, because every promotion is going to develop tropes, certain things they fall back on that they like to do over and over again. And if you watch every single match on every single show, you're going to see every single instance of those tropes. So am I fatigued by things that someone that watched half the shows in a year won't be fatigued? I don't know. But in my defense, Gabe just rebooked a show we reviewed because he didn't like how tepid the crowd was to the show before. And Gabe's about to do a big, bold booking decision, which he's going to say is in part because he felt he needed to shake things up because they were getting like stale. So maybe I'm not completely crazy. But I did like the finish in a way that Matt laid out very well. I thought what it worked is this was a classic like book. It got guys where they needed to be in a clever way. Because you think about it, the finish of this match is not Samoa Joe distracts the referee, so Nigel McGuinness loses a match. Now, you want Nigel and Joe to feud coming up, but you also want them both to still be babyfaces. You don't want the fans to turn against them. So how do you do this in an organic way? And I felt they did by having Homicide injure his shoulder. It makes sense. Oh, Joe's his friend at this point. He would come from the back and want to check on him. And it makes sense that Joe would want to tell the ref, like, you got to pay attention. He's my friend is really hurt. And that served as a natural distraction where you don't really get mad at Joe for distracting the ref, but you also understand Nigel's frustration from like, shit. And it works great for Nigel because it's another instance like that elimination tag the other night where it looked like Nigel really had Rave on the ropes, maybe about to beat him, but then an outside party comes in and steals it where, in the elimination tag, Nigel was going for the rebound lariat, and Danielson shoves Rave out of the way to save him. In this match, it's this kind of inadvertent distraction, and so I felt like everyone kind of got something from this, where they heat up Homicide with the shoulder injury, although we've just talked about how we don't think it really had an effect and was too late and all that stuff. But you keep the Rave and the Nigel Joe thing going a bit, even though Joe can't wrestle him this weekend, and you give Rave another avoiding Nigel's thing. So in that sense, I like
I like that you said you give Rave another. You give Rave another avoiding Nigel thing. I like that.
Yeah. I mean, there was more energy put into the booking of that finish than there was put into the wrestling of the match. So
Gabe was the best worker on this show.
In this match,
yeah.
Yeah. We then get a clip of Davey Richards versus Roderick Strong in an FIP heavyweight title #1 contendership match, FIP's Fallout 2006 show that took place October 13th. There's some funny weirdness watching this clip because the FIP commentators were Dave Prazak and Jared David, but it's Dave Prazak doing his FIP heel persona where he talks in like this different voice, like laid back voice, and he's talking about how Roderick Strong's inferior to Bryan Danielson, that's my man. And so it's a very weird tonal shift. And Jared David is also talking about the potential of Bryan Danielson facing Cyber Kong, which is just like, wow, what a different world we're in on this clip. But then we see a fairly lengthy clip of this Richards Roddy FIP match, but we never see who wins it. And then we get this jarring.
It's very funny to me that they did that.
Yeah, and then we get this very jarring cut to Roddy being lifted on the FIP roster shoulders after he wins the FIP title at All or Nothing on November 10th.
I had to really be like, is this a different place? Because it's like based on what you're looking, you would just think this was the end of that match, right? Like they were showing a match, then they show Roderick celebrating, and you have to be like, wait, I think that's a different venue in order to realize that this is not the same moment.
It was really weird because just to make clear, they show you an extended clip of Roddy versus Davey Richards for the #1 contendership of the FIP title, but they don't show you who wins the match. And then they show you Roderick celebrating after he beats Bryan Danielson, but they don't show you a second of him wrestling Bryan Danielson.
You don't see Bryan Danielson in that clip at all. You would have no idea he was even there.
Yeah, so I feel like you probably can piece things together if you have a little bit of knowledge of what was happening on the scene at this time.
Which is what I did. I pieced it together based on my knowledge of what was happening on the scene, yeah.
But if there's no voiceover, if you weren't following FIP online, or if you're watching this years after the fact, I think you'd be kind of confused and going, what the fuck is happening here? Like, what? And so we see Davey Richards shake Roddy's hand and hug him before getting on the mic and congratulating Roddy for kicking the crap out of Bryan Danielson. So we do get an acknowledgement there that he wrestled Bryan Danielson. And then Davey challenges Roddy for the FIP title. Roddy says he already has said that whenever Davey wants to challenge him is fine, but now's not the time for a challenge. It's time to celebrate. Davey snatches back the mic and says, there's no time for celebration. When am I going to get my title shot? Roddy again tells him, like, look, this is not the time for challenges. Later, Davey shoves him. Roddy says, like, look, I just got through a long match. Now is not the time. Davey shoves him again. They get into a big pull apart as the roster holds them back. Matt, this was 5 straight minutes of FIP. We are now, to your horror, officially an FIP review podcast.
Well, honestly, like, do you think that this FIB crossover has negatively impacted ROH in the slightest way? Because, like, obviously I don't think it's, like, a big distraction or anything, but I feel like it's more negative than positive in terms of, like, how it affects some of these matches, and that, like, it's weird to show clips of the same wrestlers and announcers having slightly different characters and then being the normal characters in ROH and like having to get excited about the potential of a title change from that. I mean, obviously, like in modern times, we all complain about the way that these like ROH titles are used in AEW and like they don't really feel meaningful and like, but at least in AEW ROH, it's like you're not having people playing slightly different characters. Like the Davey Richards in that clip is not the same Davey Richards that does promos in ROH, right? Like, it's not like it's a huge difference, but it's a little bit of a difference. And, like, you know, this, like, give me my title shot, Roderick. Like, that's this version, like, the ROH Davey Richards of this moment would not be like that. Prazak is a different human being, his character in FIP versus his character in ROH. Like, it's just weird. Like, again, like, it's nitpicking, but, you know, again, as I've said a million times, that's the whole point of this podcast is to nitpick different things. And I don't know, like I appreciate that they need to put over FIP and like Gabe books both and he wants to promote it, but I don't think that it's done ROH any favors when they've had these little FIP interludes.
Yeah, and to your kind of question about do I think this helps ROH or not? No, I think the problem is like when I think back, the times I felt like there was the most buzz or talk about FIP, which you know is a low bar, were the Homicide CM Punk match that started right when Gabe started booking FIP because it went to a strip club and that was such a weird thing that it became like got some buzz as like just a weird thing to see. And the Jack Evans Roderick Strong match, which they did in FIP before they did in Ring of Honor. And, you know, they actually named the show like Jack versus Roddy, I think, or something like that, or Strong versus Evans, almost like Joe. And to me, if you really wanted to try and get buzz for FIP, I think the path was book matches that get a real buzz for some reason, and you know that not this what they're trying to do now, which is kind of like, oh, there's just a little bit of storyline hooks where it's like, is anyone going to buy an FIP DVD after watching this and going, well, I have to see how they set up this B show Roderick Strong Davey Richards match? Like, you know, they don't really show you. I mean, like. It just doesn't work. I think the way to sell it would have been just here's a great match. Here's a minute of it that you can't see. And it was one of the best matches of the year. And if you don't buy this DVD, you're missing. And instead, like, again, you don't see a single second of Roddy versus Bryan Danielson. And maybe that's because the night before Bryan's supposed to drop the title to Homicide, maybe they don't want to show you Bryan Danielson being vulnerable and losing and hurt his aura any. But you still can kind of decipher from Davey's comments Roddy just beat Bryan Danielson. But yeah, it's like you said, there's so many weird things that when you try and combine these worlds, because they're kind of connected, but there's enough weirdness between them that like technically things that happen in FIP can affect things that happen in ROH, but the characters are different. And that's a weird mix to have. But that brings us to the semi-main event, your FIP heavyweight title match. Roderick Strong successfully defended his title, defeating Davey Richards in 21-34 by countout. This was another big match where the fans really distracted these guys. I'll get to it in a bit, but I'll start off right off the bat. This is one I didn't hear, but Brian Alvarez wrote this in Figure 4 Weekly. He wrote, Fans were chanting "baby butt wipes" DVDs for some reason during this match. These had to have been an uprising among the members of the F4W Empire, Tilda Bang, since someone on our website created a Dusty Rhodes rap built around that line, and we play the song somewhat regularly on our radio show.
Do I remember that you play that song somewhat regularly on your radio show? I would also blame you, Brian, for all of the make you humble references to the Iron Sheik. They're both your fault, Brian.
We're learning this was a very Figure 4 pilled audience. Yes. Figure 4 big in Hartford, Connecticut in 2006. This may or may not have been the most important match of the night in kayfabe, but in reality, I think it was, like, in real wrestling logic, like non-wrestling logic, it was the most important match because Roddy's trying to establish the FIP title in ROH as this workhorse mid-card title. Davey's still on his way up in ROH, and he could use another big standout singles match. And this is the semi-main event on a card that isn't exactly loaded. They get plenty of time. So, like, everything is set up here to give these two guys a chance to be like the talking point coming out of the show, if the show even dares to have a talking point. And I'll start off by saying this. This match felt substantial, and other than the mixed tag before the injury and maybe the Briscoes tag, I don't think any other match on the show thus far really felt substantial. This and the mixed tag were the two matches where I felt like you were getting an A-show effort. And to me, one of the things that really makes for a good ROH B-show is when you get a few matches, at least a couple, that feel like you're getting A-show, we're throwing it all out there and trying as hard as we can efforts. They just do a few spots that are big in some way, be it like their counters you don't always see or big effort, big bumps. Like Davey does a tornado DDT, but he does it off the turnbuckle onto the ring apron, which I thought was a really cool spot. Davey does 5 straight German suplexes, which he does not do in every match. Roddy does his running big boot, but he does it while Davey's in mid handspring off the ropes, which looked really cool. So again, they're just breaking out a few things, that make us feel like, okay, they're putting extra effort in. This is not a B show to them. But on the flip side, I will say substantial doesn't necessarily always mean great. And for me, this was not a great match. It was another strong good. It was another 3.5-star match to me. To me, this was like the Campbell's chunky soup of matches. Like those Campbell's chunky soups, they have gigantic chunks of protein and vegetables. They feel substantial, but are they actually delicious? I mean, like, not really. They're cheap mass market canned soups. Now, I think this match is better than that. I think this match, Matt, is better than chunky soup, but it is similar in the way where in some ways there's a lot of substance. They hit hard, they work really hard, they do a bunch of big spots, they give you a lengthy match, but the issue for me is it's a little too back and forth. Often you see this huge move like the apron tornado DDT that leads to a counter tease, and the other guy's doing a move themselves 1 or 2 moves later. Like, I don't feel this match has much in the way of flow or momentum, and there's also this vibe early that the crowd seemed to have those weird hecklers in it, and particularly Davey really, it seems to get under their skin. This is the match where it felt like it got under some skin here. Like, at one point, there's some heckling early, and Davey actually stops the match. He goes, "How about a fan for the guy trying to get himself over?" Which, of course, is exactly, I imagine, what that fan wants. The crowd applauds. The fan flips off Davey, and Davey invites him into the ring. Later, the crowd does appear to do a "that guy sucks" chant at that fan, who, again, seems to soak it up because it's one of those people that just wants all the attention on them. Now we're going to find out that fan is like a listener of the show. It's going to be like, "Trevor, Matt, I've been listening since day one. I was just trying to have a good time. How could you say this about me?" But anyway, later, a different fan keeps shouting for a brain buster, and Davey tells him, like, at one point, like, "I don't even do a brain buster." And then later,
he does. It's just a butterfly brain buster.
Yeah, and then later Davey says, "This is for the brain buster guy," and he kicks Roddy in the chest and shouts "brain buster." And then later, when he does DR driver, to your point, he immediately flips that fan off. But like. I often like interplay with the crowd, but this is a semi-main event, and it felt like they were spending so much time, it almost made the match seem like less big to me, because it was like, it clearly, especially Davey, got under his skin. Like that these guys.
It honestly didn't seem to bother Roderick at all.
Yeah. And then there's the end, the other notable thing about the match, where they brawl to the entrance ramp, Roddy suplexes Richards onto the middle ramp, and then he makes it back in to beat the count the last second and win the match by count out, and the crowd immediately boos. And it's interesting because I don't mind the idea of trying to establish countouts as a legitimate way to win matches. It makes things different. And for a reminder, the FIP title rules were the titles can change hands on DQ or count out, and there is a 20 count on the floor. So kind of like the pure title rules in that respect. But fans have been trained for years and years and years of count finishes just being cop-out finishes. Or hell, like in Ring of Honor itself, Nigel had used the count, clever ways of getting count wins as a heel move. So it's like a real uphill climb to convince any wrestling crowd that to not feel like they've been cheated on a count-out win, even though technically this was not a cheat count win. Like the two guys are not cheating against each other. They brawl far away from the ring. Roddy wins out. He hits a big move to Davey on the ramp, and then he gets back in the ring, and Davey can't make it back in time. Like it's a clean count win, so to speak. But it just the fans' reaction is going to be I think their gut reaction to any count is just going to be, this sucks. And I thought it was interesting. Dave Meltzer wrote in The Observer about this match. He wrote, the idea is they are booking the FIP title to where it can change via countout or DQ and teaching the fans that a match can end via countout since they've almost never done it. They just had the pure title where they did that semi-frequently.
But I guess what he should have said was they've almost never done it in a way that was not meant to be taken heelishly. Yeah. Which I do think is valid.
So overall, again, to me, it was a 3.5-star match. I enjoyed it. I didn't mind the finish, even though the live crowd did. But again, it's a real uphill climb to try and get fans to ever love a count-out finish.
Yeah, I think personally, this is one of those matches where if the crowd was more into it, it would be remembered as a much better match. Like, this was a match where they were begging for the crowd to go crazy because they were just going so hard and fast near the end. And the crowd just wasn't. And I would say this actually probably got some of the weakest crowd reactions of the whole show. Even some of the lower importance B matches early on. And, that really detracts from a match. Like, this obviously just wasn't what the crowd was looking for, which I guess you could say is the fault of the wrestlers if you want to make that argument like you were making before. But they were really doing a lot. And, maybe that early heckling took the crowd out of it. I don't know. But I do think that I agree with you that they were doing a lot of really cool stuff in this match. There was a spot where you rarely see this. Like, even when Strong was just trying to lift Davey Richards onto the top rope for a superplex position, Richard countered that into a sunset flip. I don't think I've ever remember seeing that in my life. Like someone countering just being hoisted onto the top rope. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, like to make it counters even in things you just take for granted. This is always gonna. When does listing someone on a turnbuckle not succeed? And if it doesn't succeed, it's usually because the guy kicks him once he's being sat on,
or clubs him in the back or something. Not turns it into a sunset flip. Yeah, it's also when do you see the Gibson driver reverse? Richards reversed the Gibson driver into a Rana. I thought that was really cool. They were, like you said, they were going above and beyond, like that. Like you mentioned, the handspring back kick into the sick kick, that was so cool. They really were doing really cool stuff. Even the count out finish, was cool and dramatic the way they did it. But like you said, the crowd wasn't educated to it yet, and I just think I probably like this match a little better than you, but I honestly think the number one thing that hurt this match was that the crowd was not feeling it. And this is the kind of match where the crowd reactions could have really made or broken it, and I think they didn't make it in this case. But I appreciated the effort a lot. I think they were really going for it.
And this is the match where, your argument that when we talked earlier, our discussion about whether a fan should be ejected and is it hurting people's enjoyment? It clearly hurt this match. So,
do you know what the guy was even saying?
There was multiple fans. The one fan that seemed to really piss Davey off, I never heard. I think a different fan was the guy that shouted "Brainbuster," which is another dumb thing. But at least that seems more goofy. Whatever the other fan was saying, it seemed to actually actively piss him off. So, but yeah, it just again, this is the match where when we talked about earlier about the crowd, this was a crowd really into that had a few people in it at least that were really into just making themselves the show, because even when people are telling this fan, to shut up, he's loving it. So, I also, one last thing I want to add is I think Lenny Leonard really added a lot of energy to the home stretch of this match.
He also added another "Make Him Humble" reference, but I'll
yeah. Well, you gotta take the good with the bad. I mean, but on the last couple of matches of the show, he was getting pretty hyped. It was almost felt to me like he was trying to make up for lost time. And I think on this match in particular, the energy was infectious for Dave Prazak, and he started getting a little bit more animated too. And I felt, knowing how these guys tape these late at night back to back, like that's really important when you can inject some energy. And there is, we've talked about, we're fans of Gabe commentary in a lot of ways that a lot of people aren't. There are fun Gabe bits to having Gabe Sapolsky on commentary, but this was a match where I was like, I'm glad Lenny Leonard's back. I'm a big Lenny Leonard fan. I did think, other than doing the reference, which was already dated, I thought this was a match I really noticed, like, wow, he's really trying hard here to make this match seem like big. But we then go backstage to find Samoa Joe. He says he has a medical update for Bryan Danielson. They are putting Homicide back together. He will be ready. Smokes took Homicide back to Brooklyn and guaranteed Joe a few things. Homicide will be vicious. He will be relentless. And Bryan won't be able to run like he ran from Joe and others. Joe says for all the running Bryan has done, it ends in the ring of Homicide. Let me say this. When it comes to nuts and bolts selling a future match, Homicide's not exactly the best guy at promos. Like, he's great at being Homicide. He's not really great at, like,
the classic like promo purpose. Yeah.
And this felt like they literally just decided to have Joe cut Homicide's go home promo for him. And you know what? I think that's a good decision.
I agree.
I think it's probably better than.
Yeah, this was the best hype promo for Final Battle that anyone has done.
Yeah. So we'll get to on the next show. There's a very good promo Bryan does on a video wire for the Final Battle that's really good, which we will talk about when we get to that show next time. But yeah, this was like, yeah, again, I think this is a better promo than Homicide could have cut. So kudos for getting some use out of Joe on this show. And our main event, the Ring of Honor World Tag Team title match. Christopher Daniels and Matt Sydal successfully defend the titles when they defeated Shima and Shingo in 23:49 when Sydal pinned Shingo after a Daniels best moonsault ever and a shooting star press from Sydal. Matt, this is your big main event. Does this match kind of redeem the show? Yes or no?
Okay, so I don't know if other than the Mercedes Martinez thing, I don't know that I'd quite say this show needs to be redeemed. As I think, as you listen to our review, a lot of stuff was just okay, but nothing was bad. Right? Like I would say this was in the pantheon of shows that we've watched over the past, like many months, this was nowhere close to the bottom. It was honestly probably closer to the top than the bottom, honestly, if I were going to say. So I don't know if I agree with that framing, but I thought this was a very good match. If I don't know that I would say it was great. I think there were things about it that were great. I don't think there was just maybe like a feeling missing to get it really over that level. I will say this, though. There hasn't been a major wrestling company in America in decades that's been more consistent about trying to main event the shows with the tag team titles than ROH was in this era. I know PWG did a lot, but like a company the size of ROH, like with the level of attention and the scope and the distribution of it, the reach, I guess is the word I'm looking for. They're willing to main event not only with tag team title matches, but even with tag team title matches that don't have strong storylines behind them. Because this is just a completely cold tag team title match with at least one person that's barely been in ROH, and it's main eventing. I think I know some people would think that's bad. I think that's laudable. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I think, with Aries and Strong winning the tag titles, once that happened, did they necessarily flesh out the division with enough teams, which might have been difficult? No, but like in terms of positioning the tag belts, he worked really hard once that started to try and like give a real college try to the tag belts in that sense, in a way I think he never had before.
And the Briscoes, when they win the titles, they main event with it a lot of the time. There are after that, there are teams that do. I think, ROH is good about that. And it's funny because you think like AEW, they're the ones that are like, we can main event with tag teams because the Young Bucks and stuff. And how many pay-per-views have main evented with the tag team titles? One, right? Off the top of my head that I can think of. So ROH really, walked the walk when it came to that stuff. It's not like it was on equal footing as the world title, but they did a good job. I think also the other thing I'll mention is, whatever heelishness Sydal was trying to project, he didn't really do it in the match at all. Did you notice him trying to be a heel in this match at all?
No, this felt like the Sydal of like 2 or 3 months ago.
Yeah, just making sure. I think and one more thing I'll mention before I talk about the match itself. At one point, Prazak says that CIMA and Shingo were both part of the Dragon Gate 6-man at Supercard of Honor. Not true. Shingo will be in the next one, but he was not in the 2006 version. But maybe he was recording this months later. Who knows with ROH's release schedule. As far as the match, it's sort of what you might have expected from the Dragon Gate guys in that it built slowly, but it built to a very huge crescendo in terms of fast pace, big moves. It's not quite like Dragon Gate 6-man levels, but it's definitely a faster pace ending sequence than you see in any ROH tag match. In the early part of the match, Seidel's favoring his knee a lot. He limps to the corner to tag out to Daniels. So was Seidel's knee issues, it was basically entirely selling, right? Like it wasn't like Joe where it's like, oh, this might actually be something that he has to do. I think he did. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
He did have a legit knee injury because he got pulled off the prior show.
Right.
So I don't know how much of this is him working through something or how much of it is it. I do know I didn't put in the notes. The Observer said that it was serious enough that Seidel did go to the doctor for it. So
yeah, but when it comes later in the match, when he gets to like the high flying moves, it feels like Seidel does not really favor his leg that much during that sequence. That's why I'm like, I think he's probably just selling. If anyone's acting heelish, honestly, it's CIMA. He does a rake to the eyes and stuff, chop to the head of Daniels, stuff like that. But once they get into the big spots later, it was hard for me to keep up with the play-by-play. A lot of stuff I left out, and it's a very long sequence of play-by-play that it might not be worth doing all of it, but I'll try. So CIMA and Shingo, they start double teaming. Shingo holds up Seidel, who's draped over the top rope, so CIMA can leap off the top rope and double stomp him. CIMA puts Seidel's head and neck against the middle turnbuckle, and then he does a running drop kick into Seidel's butt, jarring his head and neck against the buckle. At one point, CIMA mocks Seidel's limp during the match, which Prazak says is infuriating Matt Seidel fans here in Hartford. And I was like, I don't think there's a single person in this crowd that's infuriated about that. But they are getting legit heat on Seidel for a while, much longer than a lot of these heat sequences often are in these ROH tag matches. At one point, Shingo does the Cobra Clutch giant swing. Seidel takes that well. And then another point, CIMA knocks Daniels to the floor in Blood Generation. They double team Seidel. Shingo holds up Seidel in a wheelbarrow. Has CIMA first drops Seidel's stomach on his knees and then drives Seidel's face into the mat. Seidel finally hot tags Daniels after another wheelbarrow. He DDTs Shingo, drop kicks CIMA, comes off the top rope, and then he hot tags Daniels. And Daniels has a really good hot tag. In fact, I'm going to say this. It's probably controversial, maybe, Trevor. You tell me. Because, you expect a lot from the other three. I was actually most impressed with Daniels here. I think he really stepped up his game in a way that we have not seen in months and months, maybe years, from Christopher Daniels in ROH.
I would really have to think about the years, but I wrote my notes that I thought Daniels was really good in this match. I completely agree on that. And we've talked about this before. Recently, both of us, I think, have brought up at different times. When it comes to 2006 Christopher Daniels, doesn't have a perfect record when it comes to tags and four ways, but tag Christopher Daniels, and I think even multi-man match Christopher Daniels in Ring of Honor in 2006 is infinitely better than singles Christopher Daniels.
For sure.
Just way more likely to have good matches.
And this is, I think, the biggest example. This is TNA level effort Daniels here. He's DDTing, combo DDTing, and STOing Blood Generation. He tries to Arabian Fresh Shingo, but he's pulled to the floor. Then they do the sequence where everyone keeps stopping other wrestlers from diving until finally CIMA hits a tope onto Daniels. Then Seidel goes to the top and does a moonsault to the floor on CIMA and Shingo. Then he goes for his leaping head scissors on Shingo, who is on the top rope, but Shingo catches him, holds him upside down, and CIMA hits a basement dropkick to Shingo's face. At one point, Shingo rolls through a sunset flip by Seidel and hits him with a buckle bomb and a spinning doctor bomb. Gets a 2-count off that. Then Daniels runs in, and CIMA gets his legs tied up in a knot and suplexes Seidel while he has Daniels in the hold. and then Daniels drop kicks Cima from behind to the floor. He's moving super quick here. He holds Shingo in an inverted DDT position while Sydal comes off the top and hits him with a splash for 2. Daniels does the palm strike and goes for the Iconoclasm, and Cima blocks it. But as Prazak points out, both of those guys are known for a version of that move. So Cima gets Daniels in the opposite corner and hits his palm thrust to the top, and then does his own version of the Iconoclasm. And then Cima hits this leg twisting driver. I don't remember all the names for these moves, honestly. And then he goes for a springboard, but Daniels catches him with a Death Valley driver. And then Shingo charges, but Daniels puts him in the Koji clutch. Cima goes to break that up and hits Daniels with a frog splash. Then Sydal leaps off the ropes with a DDT on Cima, and then Shingo comes off the ropes with a big lariat to Sydal, and all 4 guys are down, and everyone's going crazy. And then Shingo gets Daniels on his shoulders, and Cima comes off the top with a crossbody. And then Shingo gets a 2 count, and Sydal breaks it up. And then Shingo holds up Daniels for a Cima super kick, but Daniels ducks. Cima kicks Shingo. They knock Cima out of the ring, and then Daniels hits the best moonsault ever on Shingo, immediately followed by the shooting star press by Sydal for the win. Like I said, Daniels was extremely motivated. He was working at a much faster pace than we've seen in ROH in forever. Definitely harder to keep up with down the stretch than any match I've reviewed, probably since the Dragon Gate 6-man. There were stretches in the middle that didn't have a ton of heat, and obviously the Dragon Gate team had no chance of winning, but they did what they could to make it exciting. I thought this was a really, really, really good match, about as good as I would say you could be without getting to the great level. I think what was missing was a sense of any sort of danger for Daniels and Sydal, and I think maybe just a little bit of intensity. But if someone said this was a great match, I wouldn't argue with them. I think they all worked their asses off, and it was really exciting. And does it redeem the show? No, I don't know if I think it needs to be redeemed. I think that it adds a cherry on top of a decent show to make this a fairly solid middle of the road B show in the end. But certainly not you got to see the show now because of this match. Nothing like that.
Well, first off, I got to give you a lot of credit for doing a great job recapping the match. I think we could never do a Dragon Gate, even if we had the interest, a Dragon Gate recap podcast. So we could never do even a Dragon Gate USA recap podcast, because I think that would kill you, because having to try and capture the gist of all the moves. But second of all, you said you wouldn't argue with someone that thought this match was great. I actually liked it a little bit more than you. I think this match was great. I would give it a flat 4 stars. I think it just scrapes into it. And I was kind of surprised at how much I liked this match. An interesting thing for me is, after my recent bitchy about ROH tag team matches being too similar, including on this show, I felt like this match still followed that same structure, but I feel like it just did some of the parts of it better, and that made all the difference. You get some busy work to start, and eventually the match has Sydal getting worked over in the middle of the match. And one of my complaints in recent tag matches is that the heat segment isn't long enough or really makes you feel anything. Now, I'm not going to say this was an amazing heat segment, but it was longer than some recent ones, and it kept me far more engaged. Part of that is probably that, knowing Sydal had recently had a real leg injury, so that just made it more interesting to watch them work his legs.
But also, he was wrestling against Cima, who's was one of the best in the world at this point.
Yeah, and part of that was also Shima and Shingo throwing in some cool double teams like you talked about. And I thought Shima being an absolute dick to Sydal at one point, where he starts limping, and he just Shima starts limping, and he's just mocking Sydal's leg injury, and then he'll hit him, and then he'll limp some more, and then he'll hit him again. And I thought Shima was just really good in this match, just crisp and charismatic and just a bit of an asshole. I love how he uses double stomps in so many different situations. It's the closest I'll get to seeing my precious boy, my special little guy, Low Key, back in Ring of Honor again. I'll have to take it, Matt. That's the most I can get. And then another recent complaint I've had about tag matches, which is I hate when the heat segment ends and the isolated guy makes his comeback and tags out, and it's not very dramatic or exciting. It's just very abrupt. And this one I thought was exciting and dramatic. Like Seidel turning a Shingo wheelbarrow lift into a DDT was a really cool spot. And then I love that CIMA immediately climbs to the top turnbuckle to leap off at Seidel because he knows Seidel's going to make the tag now, and he has to try and stop him. And Seidel drops kicks him out of midair, and then he makes a tag. And I thought that's a really good sequence to like end you getting beat down and make that big moment. In fact, when CIMA climbed to the top rope, I'm thinking, oh shit, Seidel isn't going to be able to make the tag. The beatdown's going to keep going. But no, it's a big swing right there. And then another complaint I've had is that recent tags is that the hot tag isn't that good. And I thought the Daniels hot tag was pretty darn good. Like he came in like a house of fire. And what we talked about just a minute or two ago, this is a match where I think Daniels carried a bit more of the load for his team than he normally does due to Seidel's injury maybe, or maybe that's just in my head. But like Seidel certainly did some things offensively and looked good. But I thought this was really Daniels carrying a lot of the load and offensively, especially, and just, like I said earlier, I think we've established in 2006 Ring of Honor, at least, I'm not talking about TNA or anywhere else, tag Christopher Daniels is way, way better than singles Christopher Daniels. And I don't know exactly why that is. It feels like when he's in a tags, he's more sprightly and fast paced and less likely to just kind of meander into like pointless mid-tempo stuff that doesn't really have a big payoff. I don't know why exactly that's the case. It just seems to be the case. And I thought like this was a nice example of how good he still could be in Ring of Honor in the right setting. I especially like that Daniels, he always, as you mentioned, like he normally does like the CIMA Venus Punch iconoclasm corner. And this match he tries to do it to CIMA. CIMA immediately blocks the iconoclasm and then immediately takes Daniels to the other side of the ring and does the whole thing to him. And I like that because it's one of those things where if you know both guys, they both do it. CIMA's the inventor of it. So, when they're in the ring together, you kind of want them to acknowledge that and pay that off. And they did. They did the amount. They did what you would want them to do. And then finally, my last complaint with a lot of these matches, these ROH tag matches in 2006, is that the last crazy 5 or 6 minutes are where tags are largely ignored and everyone's coming in and out of the ring aren't that big or crazy. But I thought that was better here too as well. Like I thought the last 6 or 7 minutes was lots of fun stuff. And again, I want to stress, I've seen better matches of this style. This is not a match of the year contender or anything like that. Even though I'm saying it's great, Matt said it's really, really good. I think we're probably not that far. Like I'm probably just a little over the line. He's probably just a bit under the line from the way we've both talked about this. But to me, it gets over that line just a little bit. And again, they used the recipe of so many 2006 ROH tag matches, but the quality of ingredients they put into that formula, I think they were just better this time. Dave in the Observer wrote, Shingo looked far better team with CIMA than he's looked in ROH thus far. And I noticed, again, lots of people, when I'm looking at these recaps of the time, were starting to rail on Shingo, saying he's not that good. Like, which maybe it's just the style. Maybe that's the opportunity.
It's that he was still extremely inexperienced. Like when did he start wrestling? In like 2004? Like
he was he had like a year of experience, maybe, I think, when he came into ROH. And then there was the funny bit too, where initially instead of shaking Daniel's hand at the start of the match, CIMA puts his hand on Daniel's bald head, and you can see Daniel's trying to stifle a laugh before he just breaks into a big smile. And then later in the match, CIMA slaps Daniels on the top of his head, and he immediately looks at his own hand weird, and he wipes it off like it's disgusting, and he's wiping it off on his tights. And you can hear Seidel on the apron say, "What the hell is that?" I just thought that was funny. And then, in fact, after the match, Daniels holds up the ROH tag belts, both of them, and then he lays them down in the center of the ring, and CIMA tries to pick one up, and he goes, "Is mine," and that gets laughs from the crowd. Daniels calls for a handshake, and CIMA goes to give it, but Daniels then rubs CIMA's head instead before he shakes his hands and raises both his and Shingo's arms. Crowd chants, "Please come back," as CIMA checks on Seidel's knee. All 4 men salute the crowd and pose. We get a big happy ending in the ring. And also as Daniels slaps hands around the ring, I noticed that appears Green Lantern fan is in either a suit or at least dressed up, like dressier clothes than usual. And some fan next to Green Lantern fan, points that out to Daniels, like, "Look at Green Lantern fan." And Daniels seems to get like a mild kick out of it when it's pointed out to him, like, "Look at this guy. Look, he got dressed up tonight for some reason." And then, that was the in-ring end of the show. But then we go backstage one more time to find Bryan Danielson, who asks Homicide how his shoulder is feeling. A little tight, a little painful. Brian says that's what I've been dealing with since August. He says, tonight I made a statement that Homicide will not be leaving New York City with the ROH Championship. That title is mine. And then we get a nice little brief highlight package for ROH's entire history. That's an ad for the ROH's upcoming 5th year festival events. And that is International Challenge. Matt, who gets the Matt F trophy for this episode?
Well, I think that based on my praise that I just gave and how hard I've been on him over the past couple years of reviewing his ROH matches, I got to give it up to Christopher Daniels. A first-time Matt F trophy recipient. He was awesome in that match. And he really stepped his game up. And I think he is a very deserving winner of the trophy.
Yeah, I think this was a good night for him. Well, more than a good night. I think this was a very good night for him. As far as the show goes, it's hard for me to kind of add everything together because I do think there was a lot of matches that even in the booking, you were just like, man, this really is a B show. I thought there were a lot of B show efforts, but again, Ring of Honor's floor is pretty high where a B show effort is still like an average watchable match with at least a couple moments of like real entertainment. I did think it's kind of a shame where I thought in a way I had a higher view of you because I thought there was one great match on the show in the main event, but it's kind of a weird show to judge because then there's also the 2 other shows that I think had a chance to be great, the Roddy Davey Richards match and the mixed tag. Both did not achieve that because of reasons kind of outside their control, where, the mixed tag has the horrible injury that makes the match go home early. And the mixed tag, as you mentioned, has these distracting crowd that maybe was a real element in bringing it down that clearly rattled Davey Richards and distracted him during the match. So it's a weird show to judge. I would say it's a decent B show, but I would say we've seen worse B shows than this, but in some ways this B show, like, feels more like a B show, if that makes sense. Like I don't know if I've seen many shows that feel more like a B show, but the quality of the show itself is better than some of the B shows. But like when I watch this show, from the booking of the card to the effort, I'm like, you guys on this night more than any other weren't even trying to do anything more than like, let's get through this night. Let's go do the big final battle the next night. Like going to the I read near the start where the PW Insider said, Ring of Honor was telling them that, like, hey, we want to make this a special show for the Hartford area to make up for, like, recent shows in Connecticut. It's like, I don't think it really felt like that, but it was still not a bad show.
For me, I probably liked it a little more than you. I mean, yes, like I mentioned, the Mercedes thing puts a sour note on things, but besides that, I do think it was very solid. And it wasn't like, it didn't have the bad vibes. I know you thought that the crowd was pretty bad. It didn't quite distract me as much as it did you. I didn't think it had the bad booking vibes that a lot of the shows over the past few months have had. So I probably liked it very slightly more than you. I still, think it's definitely like on the more missable scale. But here's the thing, Trevor, because I was thinking about this in context of the next show. Fucking finally, Final Battle. Like, it's been a slog, dude, getting through these past few months. Since the last, in my opinion, the last true A show that we reviewed, that ROH held, was Glory by Honor in September. There have been, if I'm counting correctly, 13 shows since then. It's been so many shows that we've had to review where it's just like, it did not feel like we were getting the full Ring of Honor picture. And this is a company that like thrived on just having great shows. And it's like, this was the saddest era of the company that we've reviewed so far, just in terms of like, oh my God, like just like another, like whether it's the bad, like horrible booking of the bitter end to just these one dead crowd after another. Again, like I knew all this in advance, like I remembered it from the time, but man, having to watch all these shows, none of them were even that like bad, or not too many of them were that bad, but it was just such like, there were just so many things that nobody would ever think to watch again. And we watched them all. I mean, like, don't feel bad for us. Like, it's still a fun gig and like easy, but like, if we're being honest about it, it's like, God, like I can't believe how lousy this company felt for so long. And I'm so excited to because I know Final Battle 2006 is a great show. Like I was there, like I've seen it, like it's a great show. It feels like almost like a rebirth in some ways. Like I can't believe how long they let themselves go without doing something big. And I guess it was just this whole thing, like this holding pattern they were in where they were just waiting to get to New York to give Homicide the title. But Man, I feel like they could have done more in the past few months. I feel like it was such a wasted era. I guess the other thing was that Danielson and the Danielson Joe feud just fell flat. I think that was probably part of it. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it was booking burnout. All I know is that I'm very happy to get the final battle. And the other thing I'll say is I know that we're not totally out of this kind of like dull era because I think the first two shows of 2007 are also kind of like this. It's really the 50-year festival and the shows that come after that really get them out of this funk. But now that you've seen it, Trevor, do you know what I was talking about? This was a real funk,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
I think this one of the things I love about this show is, you know, a lot of times we cover the big stuff and our thoughts on the big stuff. Occasionally it changes from how we remember it, but we're usually pretty similar to what we used to think. And I think one thing we've learned is like almost all, with a rare exception here or there, of the best stuff from Ring of Honor holds up 15 or more years later. But I think what I love is when we find stuff that people forgot, like when we found out that that's not a secret, it's on the tapes, but people just forgot. Like, you know, when we discovered that Nigel McGuinness did the ring, bashing his head to the ring post spot in like a random match, like a couple years before he does it in the match with Danielson that everyone remembers. Or I think this like going to what you said, like this can be fun even if the shows aren't disappointing, because like it is in a weird way. There's been some painful moments, but overall it's been enjoyable. But like there's a pleasure in knowing that, like, I think most people, including me before I did this rewatch, and you had a better memory about this than me. You warned me, Matt. But like, people just remember 2006 as part of the golden era of Ring of Honor. And maybe in some ways, some would argue it's the best year. And it might be when you add up certain things. And it is part of the golden era of Ring of Honor. There is a ton of great stuff to it. But like, people forget the last few months that we just covered. You know, they don't remember that it's not that during this year, and I think in a way that kind of tells you something about memory and stuff, where if something is like 70% good or 80% good, and that 70 or 80% is really, really like some of the best of whatever it is you've seen good, people's memories will blank out the 20 or 30%, even if it's, as it turns out, pretty crappy at some points, you know?
Yeah, it was just such a slot. They just had so many of these lesser shows. Like, just the fact that it was all double shots, it was like 2 of them every month. You just add it all up. It's like, oh my God, can we get on with it already, you know?
And I think you touched on one thing, and you were kind of throwing it as a possibility. I think I'd go even more in that direction than you. It was you throwing out, you know, you point out, you know, the Joe Danielson feud was a big part of this last like third or quarter of the year, and the Jim Cornette thing. And I do think that is a big reason. I think they were probably banking on the, you know, final battle will be the big coronation for Homicide and the end of Danielson's reign. And these two things, this Cornette feud and the Danielson Joe feud, which on paper are both big, impressive things, that will carry us through the fall and winter. And the Danielson Joe feud was disappointing. It was not terrible, but it was disappointing from what you expect from those two. The Cornette thing was a complete strikeout. And so when you have these two temple things you think are going to carry us for 3 months, and one completely turns out to be like the worst thing in the product, and one is a disappointment, yeah, that's going to be a big hill to climb, right? Like, and the problem is not enough stuff overachieved elsewhere to kind of make up for those deficiencies.
No, for sure. I mean, they relied a lot during this period on like Matt Sydal and Delirious. And while I think they worked hard and did a good job and they're both good wrestlers and stuff, I don't think that they could replace what the top tier ROH presences were able to do in previous years. And, you know, maybe that was part of it too. Like, you know, they gave it their try, and they you know, I certainly have nothing against those two guys, and like, I think they're great in their ways, but you know, when you're talking about like other eras that are carried by, you know, a fully healthy Bryan Danielson and, you know, a fully motivated Samoa Joe and CM Punk or James Gibson, or like, it's like this particular period of Matt Sydal and Delirious, they were not those guys. And I think if you like, I think what I realized, I mentioned this before, going back, is like just how much of a shine and emphasis they put on like Matt Sydal during this period. And I think,
yeah,
you know, he probably just wasn't quite ready for it.
Yeah, and but we are now we've now, Matt, we've essentially eaten our vegetables. I feel like especially you have been the Bart Simpson at Camp Krusty, basically saying, crouched in the corner saying, Krusty's coming to save us. Krusty's coming to save us. So it's been final battle is coming. Final battle is coming. And even though, as you've mentioned, it might be a brief reprieve, but basically the clouds are parting. So if you want to contact us, through-the-years@gmail.com. That's THROH for through. At Trevor Dame on Twitter. At Mayor MGF on Twitter. The real MF in this business. And next time on the show, as we talked about, we will finally, after like 2 years of this podcast being in this year, we will finish 2006. We will review Final Battle 2006. And as always, it will also be our year-end review show. And if you are a new listener, every year with Final Battle, we give you the full regular length show where we review Final Battle. And then we add on basically an extra mini episode that's usually like an hour or a little more sometimes, who knows, where we read reviews from other publications about the year in Ring of Honor. We give our own few awards. We sum up the year. We kind of look to next year. It's a fun show. It's typically some of our biggest in length and popularity shows of the year.
And I pray it's an unseasonably cool day, because I'm going to have my air conditioner and fans off for an extremely extended period of time to record that episode.
We are delaying the recording of it till October. So
No. We're going to be here this summer, whether it's a heat wave or not.
Well, we will celebrate, and a big show. Circle on your calendars. We're not giving a date yet, but just circle every day on your calendars. Check every day on the feed. So until then, until next time, have a good time. Have a great time.